Welcome back to another captivating journey through the shadowy corridors of medieval history, where scandal, power, and passion collided in the most extraordinary ways. Tonight, we delve deep into the remarkable lives and tumultuous bedchambers of some of history's most notorious medieval queens, women who redefined what it meant to be scandalous centuries before the first tabloid ever rolled off a printing press. Before we begin this fascinating exploration, please take a moment to subscribe if you genuinely enjoy the content we create here. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know where in the world you're joining us from and what time it is for you right now. It's always incredible to see our global community come together for these historical adventures. Now, get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background ambience, and let's embark on tonight's journey through time together. In the winter of 1170, while most of Europe was preparing for Christmas prayers, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine was orchestrating something far more scandalous than gift-giving. The most powerful woman in medieval Europe had just convinced her own sons to take up arms against their father, King Henry II of England. But here's the twist that history books often gloss over. Eleanor's rebellion wasn't just about politics. It was Christmas itself that gave her the perfect cover for treason. You see, our beloved holiday traditions, the feasting, the gift exchanges, the family gatherings, they were the medieval equivalent of a criminal conspiracy network. While noble families gathered for innocent Christmas courts, they were actually plotting marriages, planning wars, and trading kingdoms like we trade Christmas cookies. And Eleanor? She turned Christmas into her personal weapon of mass destruction. But she's just one of the queens you're about to meet who weaponized everything from mistletoe to midnight mass to get what they wanted. By the time we're done today, you'll never look at a Christmas crown or royal portrait the same way again. Because the women who shaped our most cherished holiday traditions, they were absolutely ruthless, and their stories are far more intoxicating than any Christmas wine. Okay, let's begin. Joanna, first of Naples, the queen with the deadly trapdoor. When Joanna ascended to the throne of Naples in 1343, she immediately made it clear that royal protocol was more of a gentle suggestion than an ironclad rule. Where traditional monarchs saw established customs, she saw opportunities for innovation. Where others saw the sanctity of one husband, she saw the practical benefits of several. Joanna would marry 4 times throughout her turbulent reign, which wasn't entirely unusual in medieval noble circles, except for one troubling pattern. Joanna had a rather suspicious habit of outliving her husbands, often with remarkable speed and under questionable circumstances. Her first husband, Andrew of Hungary, barely survived a full year of marriage. He was discovered hanging from a castle window in what court officials hastily labeled as an unfortunate accident. Unofficially, however, whispers filled the corridors of Naples, and many courtiers had serious questions about the circumstances. Joanna, for her part, appeared to have no questions whatsoever about her husband's untimely demise. Now, here's where Joanna's story takes a turn into legend that has captivated storytellers for centuries. According to popular tales that spread throughout Italy and beyond, Joanna had commissioned a rather ingenious architectural modification to her royal bedchamber, a trapdoor built directly beneath her bed. This wasn't just any ordinary trapdoor, mind you, but a sophisticated mechanism that served as what we might call a creative solution for ending romantic encounters when polite conversation simply wouldn't suffice. The legend claims that after a night of royal intimacy with a chosen partner, Joanna could activate this hidden mechanism, causing the floor to open suddenly beneath her unsuspecting companion. The unfortunate gentleman would then plummet directly into the castle moat below, creating what was essentially a medieval version of a deadly water slide. The system was efficient, dramatic, and quite possibly the invention of a very bitter former lover seeking revenge through storytelling. Whether this trapdoor actually existed remains a matter of historical debate, but the story persisted through the centuries, probably because it perfectly captured Joanna's reputation for being both charming and potentially lethal. The tale had all the elements that make legends stick: romance, danger, architectural ingenuity, and a satisfying sense of poetic justice. What we know for certain is that Joanna ruled Naples with remarkable elegance and considerable theatrical flair. She wasn't reckless in her approach to power. She was selective. Some observers called her charming and sophisticated. Others whispered that she was dangerous and unpredictable. A few wise courtiers managed to call her both, while carefully backing toward the nearest exit. Throughout her reign, Joanna demonstrated remarkable resilience and political acumen. She successfully navigated complex wars with neighboring kingdoms, weathered papal outrage over her personal conduct, outmaneuvered numerous political rivals who sought to undermine her authority, and survived more bedroom scandals than most queens could handle in several lifetimes. Through all these challenges, Joanna wore her crown with the same confidence she wore her controversial reputation, boldly and without a trace of apology. She understood that in the medieval world, perception was often more important than reality, and she crafted her image with the skill of a master artist. When death finally claimed Joanna in 1382, she was found strangled in her castle chambers, possibly murdered by one of her numerous enemies, though it could just as easily have been one of her supposed allies. In medieval politics, the line between friend and foe was often razor-thin and frequently invisible. By the time of her death, Joanna had created a legacy overflowing with drama, political intrigue, and enough scandalous gossip to keep Italian balladeers busy composing songs for generations to come. Joanna of Naples wasn't merely a queen who happened to cause scandals. She was a living, breathing headline in an age when headlines hadn't even been invented yet. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the queen who conquered the 12th century. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't simply exist in the 12th century. She dominated it with such force and personality that she essentially ran the entire era like her personal kingdom. She served as Queen of France, then Queen of England, and eventually became the mother of 2 future English kings. But Eleanor's approach to medieval power politics was unique. She didn't just play the Game of Thrones, she flipped the entire board, drank everyone's wine, and then composed a witty sonnet about the experience. Her first marriage to Louis VII of France began when she was merely 15 years old. Louis was deeply religious to the point of obsession, painfully awkward in social situations, and possessed the kind of personality that suggested his favorite hobby was marrying his cousin because he literally couldn't think of anything more interesting to do with his time. Eleanor, by sharp contrast, was witty beyond her years, wealthy beyond measure, and had the attention span of a hunting falcon in mating season. This marriage was destined for failure from the moment vows were exchanged. Louis, in what he probably considered a romantic gesture, decided to drag Eleanor along on the Second Crusade to the Holy Land. He apparently thought that a military expedition through hostile deserts, while wearing full armor and stopping frequently to pray over religious relics, would serve as the perfect romantic getaway. Eleanor, being a practical woman, brought along fine clothes, talented musicians, and quite possibly developed a soft spot for her remarkably handsome uncle, Raymond, who happened to be the Prince of Antioch. Rumors about Eleanor and Raymond began swirling through the Crusader camps like desert sand. Louis spent most of his time frowning disapprovingly at everything and everyone. The marriage died quietly and definitively over what history records as a particularly cold supper in Damascus, where both parties finally acknowledged that their union had been doomed from the start. After securing an annulment, Eleanor practically sprinted back to her beloved Aquitaine and immediately remarried. Her new husband was Henry Plantagenet, who would soon become Henry II of England. Henry was 11 years younger than Eleanor, possessed striking red hair, and was wildly unpredictable in ways that made him exactly Eleanor's type. Their marriage would eventually produce 10 children, spark multiple wars, and create one of the most passive-aggressive royal households in all of European history. But Eleanor's true genius lay not in producing future monarchs, though she certainly excelled at that, but in revolutionizing medieval culture through her patronage of the arts. At her magnificent court in Poitiers, she championed the revolutionary concept of courtly love, a sophisticated new literary genre that encouraged noble ladies to be adored from afar by hopeless knights who suffered from emotional problems but possessed excellent cheekbones and impressive sword skills. Of course, The from afar part of courtly love was more theoretical than practical. Eleanor's court became famous for stolen glances across crowded halls, elaborate lute performances with hidden meanings, and long romantic walks that somehow always ended up behind convenient tapestries. Her court in Poitiers became the premier destination for nobles who possessed more passion than impulse control, creating what was essentially medieval Europe's first literary salon. When Henry's famously wandering eye grew tired of monogamy and began straying from Eleanor, she responded with the kind of strategic thinking that only a brilliant mother could devise. She helped her own sons stage a full-scale rebellion against their father. Henry, unsurprisingly, was not amused by this turn of events. Eleanor, however, seemed to find the entire situation rather satisfying. As punishment for her role in the rebellion, Eleanor was placed under what amounted to royal house arrest for 16 long years. For most people, this would have been a devastating setback. For Eleanor, it simply meant more time to write politically charged letters, sip excellent wine, and plot elaborate revenge schemes through her strategically placed children throughout Europe. Eleanor's influence on medieval culture extended far beyond her own lifetime, establishing traditions of romantic literature and courtly behavior that would influence European society for centuries to come. Margaret of Burgundy and the scandalous Tower of Nesle affair. Margaret of Burgundy initially appeared to be exactly the kind of queen that medieval France expected and deserved. She possessed all the correct qualifications: royal bloodlines stretching back generations, a proper marriage to the heir of France, an elegant appearance in fur-trimmed gowns that cost more than most peasants would see in a lifetime, and most importantly, she had never openly poisoned anyone during formal court dinners. On paper, she was the perfect model of a medieval wife and future queen. However, the year 1314 would prove that keeping 3 intelligent princesses bored and unsupervised in a castle was a recipe for gossip, elaborate embroidery projects, and extramarital activities that would rock the French kingdom to its very foundations. Margaret was married to Louis, who would eventually become Louis X of France, a man whose natural charisma was frequently compared to boiled cabbage by those who were feeling generous. Their marriage was decidedly not what anyone would describe as thrilling or emotionally fulfilling. Margaret apparently grew extremely tired of reading psalms for entertainment and pretending that Louis's bedtime stories about tax reform innovations were seductive or even mildly interesting. This is where the infamous Tower of Nesle affair enters our story, a scandal with a name so inherently dramatic that it sounds like it was invented by medieval soap opera writers who had consumed too much wine while brainstorming plot twists. According to historical accounts that have fascinated scholars for centuries, Margaret and her sister-in-law Blanche began conducting secret meetings with 2 exceptionally handsome Norman knights in clandestine locations throughout Paris. The location they chose for their romantic rendezvous was the Tower of Nesle, a royal tower conveniently located by the Seine River that offered the perfect combination of privacy, luxury accommodations, and apparently soundproof walls that were ideal for courtly whispers and significantly less courtly behavior. The knights involved in this royal scandal were Philippe d'Aunay and Gautier d'Aunay, brothers who possessed both the physical attractiveness and complete lack of political wisdom that made them perfect candidates for this type of dangerous liaison. They were eventually caught through what might be the most embarrassingly mundane betrayal in royal history. They were recognized by the distinctive pattern embroidered on their pillowcases. Yes, you read that correctly. The downfall of a Queen of France and the destruction of one of medieval Europe's greatest scandals was triggered by household linens and poor laundry management. Royal servants, who apparently paid very close attention to textile details as part of their daily duties, noticed that the knights possessed luxury bedding that was identical in every detail to the linens used exclusively in the princess's private chambers. The pattern, thread count, and embroidery work were unmistakably royal and clearly not something that knights could have afforded on their military salaries. This wasn't a case of international espionage or sophisticated political maneuvering or even creative use of exotic poisons. The entire scandal unraveled because of bad laundry choices and servants who were perhaps a bit too observant about thread patterns. King Philip IV, Margaret's father-in-law and the reigning monarch of France, was decidedly not amused by these revelations. Known for his stern demeanor and intolerance for behavior that embarrassed the royal family, Philip ordered that the knights be tortured and executed publicly with the kind of dramatic flair that was designed to send a clear message about the consequences of dallying with French royalty. As for Margaret herself, she was immediately thrown into prison at Château Gaillard, a fortress with a name that was about as cheerful as its accommodations were comfortable, which is to say, not at all. She died in that prison 2 years later, either from illness, suffocation, or quite possibly because her husband Louis decided he needed a completely clean slate before officially ascending to the throne of France. Medieval historical records are frustratingly vague on the specific details and remain suspiciously quiet about whether the incriminating pillowcases were ever returned to their proper owners. Margaret's ultimate crime wasn't engaging in political treason or practicing witchcraft or plotting against the crown. Her downfall came from being a little too charming in the wrong tower, with the wrong men, on the wrong luxury linens. In medieval France, that combination was apparently enough to get a person completely erased from official history. The Tower of Nesle affair became legendary, not just for its scandalous nature, but for demonstrating how even the smallest details could bring down the most powerful people in the kingdom. Isabella of France, the she-wolf who invaded her own kingdom. Isabella of France possessed everything that a medieval queen could reasonably desire: impeccable royal bloodline, a magnificent crown, access to the finest French fashion imported at enormous expense, and a husband she absolutely could not tolerate. She married Edward II of England in 1308, and what should have been a fairy tale union quickly transformed into a cautionary tale about incompatible personalities and misplaced royal affections. Edward II was tall, reasonably handsome, and possessed the kind of physical presence that should have made him an ideal medieval king. However, he was significantly more emotionally available to his male favorites than he ever was to his wife, which created complications that went far beyond typical marital discord. From the very beginning of their marriage, Isabella faced serious competition for her husband's attention. Edward was already deeply attached to one Piers Gaveston, a charming Gascon knight who possessed an exceptional flair for fashion, an impressive collection of expensive jewelry, and the political wisdom of a fruit bat with learning disabilities. Edward lavished Gaveston with titles, valuable land grants, expensive gifts, and the kind of constant attention that most wives had to spend years earning through diplomatic efforts and strategic childbearing. The situation became embarrassingly obvious during Isabella and Edward's coronation banquet, where Gaveston appeared wearing more jewels than the newly crowned queen herself. Isabella definitely noticed this breach of protocol and royal etiquette, and she filed the information away for future reference. Gaveston was eventually exiled from England due to pressure from angry nobles, then recalled when Edward missed him too much, then exiled again when he continued to behave inappropriately, and finally beheaded by thoroughly annoyed nobles who had grown deeply unimpressed with his elaborate eyeliner and insufferable smugness. Isabella might have shed a single royal tear at news of his death. Or perhaps not. Historical records are unclear on her emotional response. However, just when observers thought the marital drama had reached its peak, Edward replaced Gaveston with Hugh Despenser the Younger, a man whose greed and unpopularity made Gaveston look like a delightful picnic companion by comparison. Despenser wasn't content to simply share the king's bedchamber. He also positioned himself in control of the royal treasury, dominated the king's council, and managed to appear in virtually every important noble's nightmares on a regular basis. Despenser made the strategic error of exiling Isabella's political allies, seizing her personal lands without legal justification, and insulting her publicly in front of the entire court. This was an impressively bold strategy, considering that insulting queens has historically proven to be extremely unwise from both political and personal safety perspectives. By 1326, Isabella had endured quite enough of this treatment. She took her teenage son, the future Edward III, and fled to France under the diplomatic pretense of negotiating on behalf of her husband's government. Once safely in France, she encountered Roger Mortimer, a nobleman with a rebellious streak that matched her own, a strong jawline that was definitely appealing, and most importantly, a completely available marital status. Together, Isabella and Mortimer did something that was unprecedented in medieval European history. They launched a full-scale invasion of England. Yes, really, a Queen of England invaded her own country, accompanied by her boyfriend and her teenage son, leading an army against her own husband. This wasn't a subtle political maneuver or quiet palace coup. This was open warfare with ships, soldiers, and battle banners. The invasion succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Edward II was captured, formally deposed through legal proceedings, and then died in prison under circumstances that remain mysterious to this day. One particularly graphic rumor that circulated throughout England suggested that a red-hot poker was involved in his death. Most serious historians now consider this story an exaggeration designed to emphasize the gruesome nature of his end, but Isabella's hands were definitely not entirely clean in the matter. Isabella ruled England as regent for several years, sharing both political power and probably bed linens with Roger Mortimer, until her son Edward III grew tired of watching his mother's romantic arrangements and decided to overthrow both of them in his own political coup. Isabella was eventually sent into comfortable retirement because even rebellious queens who invade their own countries need to rest eventually. She had entered the story as a neglected wife and left it as a legendary figure who proved that queens could be just as capable of military conquest as any king. Agnes of Navarre, the cultured queen with a mysterious body count. Agnes of Navarre was born into a world overflowing with poetry, complex politics, and families that specialized in passive-aggressive dynasties that could maintain feuds for generations. As the daughter of a king and sister to a troubadour queen, she was raised in an environment where words were sharp as swords, political alliances were even sharper, and a well-placed romantic affair could either fix almost any diplomatic problem or completely ruin everything depending on timing and execution. She became Queen of Aragon through marriage to King James II's grandson, which initially sounded like an excellent arrangement until the reality of her situation became clear. Her new husband, who would eventually be known as James IV, was already halfway down the path to complete lunacy when they wed. This wasn't the romantic, artistic type of madness that poets sometimes celebrated. This was the significantly more disturbing variety that involved waking up screaming in the middle of the night and accusing the bedroom curtains of committing treason against the crown. Agnes responded to this challenging domestic situation with the practical wisdom that any self-respecting medieval noblewoman with extremely limited options would employ. She began turning her romantic and emotional attention elsewhere, quietly, repeatedly, and with what appeared to be an excellent eye for variety and discretion. Her list of alleged lovers, according to court gossips and historical speculation, included knights with impressive combat records, cultured courtiers who could discuss philosophy and poetry, talented musicians who could serenade her properly, and quite possibly at least one monk whose religious vows proved to be significantly less binding than his superiors had hoped. Agnes was universally acknowledged to be charming, highly cultured, and fluent in what medieval courtiers called the language of flirtation. In the sophisticated court of Aragon, this skill was considerably more useful than knowing Latin, and probably significantly more dangerous as well, since romantic intrigue could lead to political complications that lasted for decades. Of course, secrets don't remain secret for very long in castles filled with stone walls that carry whispers and bored servants who have little entertainment beyond observing their betters' personal lives. Rumors about Agnes's romantic activities began to circulate throughout the court, and before long, her love life had become more popular reading material than the Psalms, which was saying quite a lot in an age when religious texts dominated most people's literary consumption. Now, to be completely fair to Agnes's reputation, she was never officially caught in any compromising situations. There was no public trial, no dramatic confession extracted under legal duress, and no official church condemnation of her behavior. However, people did begin dying around her, with remarkable frequency and suspicious timing. A political rival here, a gossipy lady's maid there, and one particularly unfortunate courtier who apparently tripped and fell into a very deep and conveniently full moat under circumstances that raised eyebrows throughout the kingdom. Was Agnes actually behind these convenient deaths? We will never know for certain, and medieval record-keeping was not exactly designed to track this type of information. However, the kitchen staff reportedly began locking the spice cabinets whenever she passed by, just as a precautionary measure, which suggests that her reputation for danger was well established among the people who prepared food in the royal household. Eventually, her husband James IV died, which was shocking primarily because it apparently wasn't by Agnes's hand, despite the fact that he would have been the most obvious target for any ambitious queen looking to improve her domestic circumstances. Instead, he succumbed to his mental illness and whatever other ailments plagued medieval royalty who didn't have access to modern psychiatric care. After becoming a widow, Agnes made the practical decision to retire to a convent, though this wasn't necessarily motivated by guilt or religious awakening. Convents were simply where noble women went when they wanted to read books in peace, pray without interruption, and quietly outlive whatever scandals they had accumulated during their more active years. The nuns, as a general rule, didn't ask nosy questions about their residents' past lives, which made religious communities ideal retirement destinations for women with complicated histories. Agnes never remarried after her husband's death, possibly because no eligible nobleman was brave enough to propose to her, or perhaps because she had finally discovered the peace and quiet that had been missing from her tumultuous married life. Agnes of Navarre left behind no legitimate heirs to carry on her bloodline, but she did leave an impressive legacy that included whispers in court corridors, persistent rumors that followed courtiers for years, and a cautionary warning embedded in every love poem that ended too suddenly or under mysterious circumstances. Joanna of Castile, the queen who loved too much. Joanna of Castile was born a princess with all the advantages that royal blood could provide, achieved queenship through dynastic marriage, and became a walking cautionary tale about the dangers of becoming way too emotionally attached to one's spouse. Her story serves as a medieval reminder that passionate love, when taken to extremes, can transform into something much darker and more destructive. She married Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, and importantly, that wasn't merely a flattering nickname bestowed by generous courtiers. Philip was genuinely considered the medieval equivalent of a movie star, complete with flowing blonde hair that caught the light perfectly, impressively muscled calves that were frequently admired by court ladies, and the kind of confident smirk that suggested he had never once in his entire life been required to do household chores or consider other people's feelings. Joanna, despite all her careful royal training in emotional restraint and diplomatic detachment, fell completely and utterly in love with this magnetic man. Their marriage began as an intensely passionate romance, filled with the kind of dramatic declarations and public displays of affection that made courtiers uncomfortable and servants gossip endlessly. Unfortunately, their fairy tale romance didn't last long. Philip possessed natural charisma and political ambition, but he was also completely allergic to the concept of monogamy. He cheated on Joanna constantly, starting subtly with brief flirtations and discreet affairs, then progressing to the kind of reckless romantic abandonment that was usually reserved for poorly written romance novels with improbable plots. Joanna, who had never been taught to accept betrayal gracefully, responded to Philip's infidelities with fits of rage that shocked the sophisticated Burgundian court, public interrogations of suspected mistresses, and according to some historical sources, at least a few attempts at what diplomatic records euphemistically described as hair-pulling diplomacy. However, the situation took a genuinely strange and disturbing turn when Philip suddenly dropped dead in 1506. The official cause of death was allegedly drinking cold water immediately after playing an energetic game of ball, which was considered a plausible medical explanation even by 16th century standards, though it strikes modern readers as suspiciously vague and probably inaccurate. Joanna's reaction to Philip's death wasn't the usual royal grief involving black veils, formal mourning periods, and graceful acceptance of widowhood. Instead, she was devastated in the most literal sense possible. She became the dig up the body and carry it around everywhere kind of devastated, which she proceeded to do for several months without regard for social conventions or basic sanitation. She ordered Philip's coffin to be opened repeatedly because she needed to personally verify that no one had stolen his remarkably handsome corpse. She kissed his dead lips with disturbing frequency, apparently attempting to maintain some form of romantic connection with his increasingly decomposed remains. Most disturbing of all, she refused to allow any women near Philip's coffin because she was genuinely concerned that even in death, other women might develop romantic ideas about her deceased husband. Apparently, even as a corpse, Philip was considered a significant flight risk when it came to attracting female attention, which says something remarkable about either his lasting physical appeal or Joanna's complete disconnection from reality. Joanna traveled extensively across Castile with Philip's coffin in tow, stopping at monasteries along the way and insisting on sleeping next to the increasingly problematic remains. According to some rumors that medieval chroniclers were understandably reluctant to document in detail, she may have even attempted to sleep with the corpse itself, though the historical accounts become diplomatically vague around this particular point, either out of respect for royal dignity or sheer discomfort with the subject matter. People throughout the kingdom began whispering about the Queen's mental state. Court officials panicked about the political implications of having an obviously unstable ruler. Her father Ferdinand eventually declared her mentally incompetent to rule and had her confined to a convent for the remaining 46 years of her life, which established a record for emotionally intense queens that has never been broken. The question that historians continue to debate is whether Joanna was genuinely suffering from mental illness or was simply a grief-stricken woman whose mourning exceeded acceptable social boundaries. Either way, she remains one of the few medieval queens who is remembered more for her post-mortem romance than for anything she accomplished with the living. Catherine the Great, the empress who conquered more than just territories. First, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather the horse that wasn't actually in the room. No, Catherine the Great did not die while attempting intimate relations with a horse. However, the fact that we even need to clarify this point should give you a clear idea of exactly how wild her reputation became and how industriously the 18th century gossip machine worked overtime once she had annoyed the right combination of powerful people. Catherine technically falls outside our medieval time frame, but she earns her place in this discussion through sheer scandal density alone. Her life contained enough romantic intrigue, political maneuvering, and sexual controversy to supply material for several medieval queens, which makes her impossible to ignore when discussing royal women who redefined the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Born Princess Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornburg, a minor German princess with an impressively long name and limited political prospects, she married into Russian royalty and quickly discovered that her new husband Peter III was significantly less of a czar and significantly more of a grown child with an extensive collection of military toys and a concerning fondness for Prussia that bordered on obsession. Peter preferred playing with miniature soldiers to running an empire that stretched across multiple continents, and he was considerably more interested in discussing military strategy than spending time with his wife or fulfilling any of the basic responsibilities that came with ruling the largest country in the world. Catherine's response to this disappointing domestic situation was characteristically bold and practical. She began looking elsewhere for intellectual stimulation, emotional connection, and physical satisfaction. She took lovers, numerous lovers, with a systematic approach that was both impressive and slightly intimidating. Her romantic partners included military officers with distinguished service records, court nobles with political influence, poets who could compose verses in her honor, and quite possibly a furniture maker whose craftsmanship apparently extended beyond woodworking. Some of Catherine's lovers were significantly younger than she was. Others possessed terrifyingly competent administrative skills that proved useful for running an empire. One particularly famous lover was only 18 years old when Catherine was 60, which strikes modern observers as less scandalous and more motivational when you consider the Empress's remarkable stamina and continued attractiveness well into what was considered advanced age by 18th century standards. However, Catherine wasn't reckless or random in her romantic choices. She was calculating, strategic, and practical about her affairs in ways that demonstrated her political intelligence. She rewarded successful lovers with valuable estates and prestigious titles, creating what amounted to a royal loyalty program with excellent benefits. Impress the Empress through competent performance in bed and government service, and you could walk away with land grants and maybe a comfortable pension for life, fail to meet her standards or disappoint her expectations. Well, there was always exile to Siberia, where the climate was unforgiving and the career opportunities were extremely limited. Now, returning to that persistent and ridiculous rumor about Catherine's death. Sometime after she died peacefully of a stroke, malicious political enemies or exceptionally bored aristocrats who had too much time on their hands began spreading the completely fabricated tale that Catherine had died while attempting intimate relations with a horse. This story was so anatomically implausible and logistically impossible that any reasonable person should have dismissed it immediately as obvious nonsense. Unfortunately, the rumor refused to die, probably because it was so outrageous that it became memorable in the way that truth rarely manages to be. Why did this absurd story persist and spread throughout Europe? Because Catherine was a powerful woman who ruled an empire without needing a man to make decisions for her. She implemented major governmental reforms, crushed several rebellions through military force, expanded Russian territory through successful wars, and told the Orthodox Church to mind its own business when it came to political matters. Naturally, the only way that some people could psychologically handle a woman wielding this much power successfully was to invent a story involving livestock and impossible sexual logistics that would reduce her legacy to a crude joke, rather than acknowledging her remarkable achievements as a ruler. In reality, Catherine died of a stroke while lying in her bed, fully clothed, surrounded by her courtiers, with absolutely no livestock present anywhere in the palace. But the psychological damage was already done. The myth lived on because people consistently love scandal more than truth, and Catherine, who was already scandalous enough during her lifetime to supply material for several biographies, became downright legendary after her death. She may never have engaged in intimate relations with a horse, but she absolutely dominated European history like she personally owned every important event that occurred during her reign. Fredegund of Neustria, the knife-wielding queen. If you harbored any romantic notions about medieval queens spending their time doing delicate embroidery work while sighing wistfully by candlelight, allow me to introduce you to Fredegund of Neustria, a woman who believed strongly in the importance of marital duty, royal dignity, and solving problems by stabbing her enemies directly in the neck. Born into servitude with no royal bloodline or inherited advantages, Fredegund rose through the ranks of the Frankish court with the kind of ruthless efficiency that usually requires either extreme natural charisma or an impressive body count. In her particular case, it was definitely both, combined with a strategic intelligence that would have impressed Machiavelli if he had been born several centuries earlier. She first caught the attention of King Chilperic I of Neustria, a Frankish king who already had a wife, but apparently didn't consider that an insurmountable obstacle to pursuing new romantic interests. His first queen died mysteriously and very conveniently shortly after Fredegund appeared on the scene, which was shocking, truly shocking to everyone who was pretending to be surprised. Chilperic's second wife, Galsvintha, was discovered strangled in her bed not very long after marrying the king, under circumstances that were suspicious even by medieval standards, where royal deaths were frequently attributed to mysterious causes. Fredegund, who by this time had become firmly established as the king's acknowledged favorite, denied any personal involvement in these tragic events repeatedly, and with the kind of innocent tone that usually indicates, "I may be holding a bloody pillow, but that doesn't prove anything specific." Once she had successfully married King Chilperic herself, Fredegund didn't moderate her violent tendencies or settle into peaceful domestic life. Instead, she escalated her aggressive approach to problem-solving in ways that made her previous activities look restrained by comparison. She was well known throughout the kingdom for keeping a sharp knife concealed under her pillow at all times. This wasn't a symbolic gesture or decorative accessory. This was a practical tool that she used regularly and effectively. Fredegund treated bedtime like a potential crime scene and always wanted to be prepared for unexpected visitors with hostile intentions. Political rivals who opposed her policies were systematically poisoned using methods that were efficient and difficult to trace. Bishops who dared to criticize her behavior in public sermons had a disturbing tendency to disappear mysteriously, often while traveling on roads that were supposedly safe and well patrolled. Servants who developed reputations for being too gossipy about royal household affairs suffered permanent solutions to their loose tongues, usually involving fatal accidents that couldn't be directly attributed to any specific person. Her legendary feud with her sister-in-law Brunhild of Austrasia became the stuff of Frankish legend that was still being told around hearth fires centuries later. These two formidable women spent decades waging what was essentially a royal version of mean girl warfare, but with significantly more assassinations, military campaigns, and political manipulation than typical social conflicts. The scope and creativity of their mutual hatred was truly impressive to behold. Fredegund once sent a hired assassin to murder Brunhild's son during a religious mass, demonstrating that she considered church sanctuary to be more of a guideline than an actual rule. Subtlety was definitely not her strong suit, but effectiveness certainly was. Even after her husband Chilperic suffered his own very suspicious assassination, which may or may not have been orchestrated by Fredegund herself depending on which historical account you choose to believe, she continued to wield considerable political power. She ruled as regent for her young son Clothar II, handling complex diplomatic negotiations through creative intimidation tactics, crushing rebellions with extreme violence that discouraged future uprisings, and quite probably stabbing at least one more person during what was supposed to be a peaceful dinner party. Fredegund wasn't merely feared throughout the kingdom, she was genuinely respected by many nobles, though this respect was primarily motivated by terror rather than admiration. Her political effectiveness was undeniable, even if her methods were occasionally questioned by people who valued their own continued breathing. Remarkably, after a lifetime of violence, political intrigue and strategic murder, Fredegund died peacefully in her own bed surrounded by family members, which feels like a significant clerical error in the grand narrative of her blood-soaked life. It seems almost unfair that someone who had lived so violently should be allowed to die so quietly. Fredegund didn't just occasionally sleep with knives for protection. She essentially was a knife herself, sharp, cold, dangerous, and always ready for action. She makes most of the other queens discussed in this presentation look like they were playing elaborate games with wooden spoons rather than engaging in serious political warfare. Anne Boleyn, the fatal flirtation with a king. Anne Boleyn wasn't born with the expectation of becoming queen. She was born to be noticed, to command attention, and to excel at what medieval courtiers called the delicate art of eyebrow archery. She possessed the rare combination of intelligence, style, and natural charisma that allowed her to dominate any room filled with powdered men who mistakenly believed that speaking Latin made them irresistibly attractive to sophisticated women. She arrived at the English court in the early 1500s, like a fashionable storm system that nobody saw coming, but everyone immediately felt. According to some contemporary accounts, Anne wasn't conventionally beautiful by the rigid standards of Tudor England, but she possessed something far more dangerous than mere physical attractiveness. She was magnetic in that particularly compelling way that announced, "I'm considerably smarter than you are, and I'm fully aware of this fact." King Henry VIII took one long look at Anne Boleyn and promptly forgot that he already had a perfectly functional wife named Catherine of Aragon, who had been serving competently as queen for nearly 2 decades. Unfortunately for Queen Catherine, Anne wasn't remotely interested in becoming just another royal mistress who would be quietly installed in comfortable apartments and periodically visited when the king needed diversion from his royal duties. Anne aimed significantly higher than that, specifically at crown level. Henry pursued Anne with the kind of obsessive determination that was both romantic and slightly terrifying. He wrote her love letters that were equal parts passionate obsession and teenage diary entries, filled with declarations that would have embarrassed most grown men, but apparently seemed perfectly reasonable to a king who was accustomed to getting everything he wanted. When the Pope refused to grant Henry an annulment so he could marry Anne, Henry did what any reasonable monarch would do. He tore the entire country in half religiously and politically, literally creating the Church of England specifically so he could slide a wedding ring onto Anne's very ambitious finger. This wasn't simply romance. This was state-sponsored seduction that changed the course of English history, European politics, and religious practice across multiple countries for centuries to come. Henry upended over 1,000 years of Catholic tradition, defied the Pope's authority, risked war with Catholic Europe, and fundamentally altered England's relationship with the rest of Christendom, all because he wanted to marry a woman who had mastered the art of saying no until she could negotiate for a crown. Once she finally achieved queenship, Anne Boleyn was absolutely not content to sit quietly in her royal apartments, produce male heirs on demand, and avoid expressing opinions about political matters. She was sharp-tongued when the situation called for directness, openly opinionated about policies that affected the kingdom, and consistently disliked by approximately half the court, mostly because she had the audacity to say exactly what she thought, and refused to faint gracefully when courtiers attempted to flatter her with obvious lies. Anne also developed a habit of teasing Henry in public settings, which provided entertainment for observers, but was an impressively bold strategy considering the king's well-documented track record with wives who annoyed him. She apparently believed that her intelligence and wit would protect her from the fate that had befallen previous women who had crossed the king's will. Unfortunately, Anne's downfall came through a problem that she couldn't solve through clever conversation or political maneuvering. She failed to produce a male heir. She gave birth to Elizabeth, who would eventually rule England with unprecedented skill and transform it into a major European power, but at the time, Elizabeth's birth was considered a major disappointment to a king who was obsessed with having sons to continue his dynasty. Suddenly, Anne's flirtatious charm wasn't charming anymore. Her wit seemed insulting rather than entertaining. Her independence appeared threatening rather than attractive. Henry, who possessed the attention span of a spoiled child and the power to act on his impulses without consequences, began looking for ways to dispose of his second wife so he could try again with someone else. The rumors that led to Anne's downfall were absurd, even by Tudor standards, which is saying quite a lot considering the generally paranoid atmosphere of Henry's court. She was accused of conducting affairs with multiple courtiers simultaneously, committing incest with her own brother George, and practicing witchcraft to maintain her hold over the king's affections. Most of these charges were so ridiculous that they wouldn't have convinced a reasonable person, but Henry wasn't particularly interested in reasonable evidence when he had already decided on his conclusion. Anne was arrested, subjected to a trial that would have embarrassed a kangaroo court, and ultimately executed by a specially imported French swordsman because Henry wanted her death to be performed with professional competence. If you're going to murder your wife for political convenience, the thinking apparently went, you might as well be classy about the execution method. Anne Boleyn lost her head literally and figuratively, but she certainly didn't lose her historical legacy. She remains the queen who successfully played the most dangerous game in medieval politics, won herself a crown through strategic patience and political intelligence, and lost everything because she dared to say no to a king before she was willing to say yes. Her daughter Elizabeth would eventually prove that the Boleyn bloodline was far more valuable than Henry ever realized. Christina of Denmark, the queen who delivered the perfect insult. Some queens throughout history rose to power through scandal, others through carefully calculated seduction, and still others through strategic marriages that benefited their families' political ambitions. And then there's Christina of Denmark, who achieved historical immortality through self-preservation instincts and her remarkable ability to deliver a verbal slap that was so perfectly crafted it could sting without smudging her lipstick. Christina was born into Danish royalty in 1521, during an era when teenage girls were essentially walking diplomatic treaties wrapped in expensive velvet gowns and expected to smile graciously while being traded between kingdoms like valuable commodities. She was married off at a young age, which was standard procedure in the 16th century when royal daughters were considered strategic assets rather than individuals with personal preferences. Her husband, Francesco II Sforza, Duke of Milan, died shortly after their wedding, leaving Christina a widow at the remarkably young age of 16. For most teenage girls, becoming widowed would have been a tragedy, but for a royal woman in the Renaissance, it was actually something approaching the ideal situation. She now possessed wealth, political independence, and most importantly, nobody was trying to explain taxation policies to her over dinner every evening. Enter King Henry VIII of England, who was recently single after Anne Boleyn had unfortunately lost her head, and who was already demonstrating the kind of impatience with the mourning process that would have concerned any reasonable woman who valued her continued existence. Henry was actively hunting for wife number 3, and Anne Boleyn's blood was still metaphorically cooling, so to speak. Being the thorough kind of king who liked to examine his potential wives before committing to marriage, Henry sent Hans Holbein the Younger, his court portrait painter, to capture Christina's likeness and assess her overall suitability as royal wife material. This was the Tudor equivalent of online dating, except with significantly higher stakes and considerably less opportunity for the woman to misrepresent her appearance or interests. Christina, being both politically astute and completely uninterested in becoming Henry's third attempt at finding a satisfactory wife, looked carefully at this marriage proposal and delivered what has become one of history's most perfectly crafted rejections. She reportedly told the English ambassadors, "If I had 2 heads, I would happily put one at the disposal of the King of England." This response wasn't merely a polite refusal. This was a masterpiece of diplomatic insult that managed to be simultaneously courteous and absolutely devastating. Christina had essentially told Henry that she would only consider marrying him if she could afford to lose her head in the process, which was both a reference to Anne Boleyn's recent fate and a clear statement about Henry's reputation as a husband who solved marital problems through execution. King Henry was reportedly not amused by this response, which demonstrates that he possessed even less sense of humor about his wife-killing reputation than most people would have expected. However, his lack of amusement didn't deter him from continuing to pursue Christina for several more months, because apparently nothing says true romance quite like ignoring a woman's clearly stated reluctance and pushing forward with marriage negotiations anyway. Christina, however, remained firmly and consistently unenthusiastic about the prospect of becoming Queen of England and possible victim number 3. She had clearly learned from observing the fates of Henry's previous wives that breathing was significantly more enjoyable than wearing a crown that came with life-threatening job hazards. Instead of risking her neck by becoming Henry's 3rd queen and potentially joining Anne Boleyn in an early grave, Christina chose a much safer romantic path. She eventually married Francis I, Duke of Bar, who possessed the considerable advantage of never having beheaded any of his previous wives, which made him an extremely attractive marriage prospect by comparison. Christina lived comfortably as a duchess, ruled her territories wisely without causing any major scandals, and most importantly, managed to keep her head attached to her shoulders for the entire rest of her life, which represented a significant victory when viewed in historical context. Later in her life, she served effectively as regent for various territories, dabbled successfully in military strategy during regional conflicts, and continued to commission portraits of herself, because sometimes it's simply pleasant to be admired and remembered without having to worry about receiving a marriage proposal from a man who collected wives like some people collect decorative swords. Christina never made it to the English throne, but her perfectly timed insult became legendary throughout Europe and beyond. She remains historical proof that sometimes the most powerful political move isn't accepting a crown when it's offered. It's having the wisdom and courage to dodge it entirely, preferably while delivering a verbal blow so cutting that historians will still be giggling about it 500 years later. Maria of Portugal, the possessive mother-in-law from medieval hell. Maria of Portugal began her royal journey following the same unfortunate pattern as many noble women of her era. Reluctantly married to a man who was twice her age, expected to smile politely during formal court functions, and ideally produce a legitimate heir without asking too many questions about her husband's rather obvious extramarital activities. She was married to Alfonso XI of Castile, a king who possessed considerable battlefield glory, an ego roughly the size of Toledo, and a mistress named Leonor de Guzman, whom he openly preferred to his actual wife. Alfonso didn't just conduct this affair behind closed doors with appropriate discretion. He flaunted his relationship with Leonor like she was a trophy wife with a significantly more interesting backstory and considerably more appealing conversation skills than his legitimate queen. Maria, quite understandably, was considerably less than thrilled with this arrangement. She dutifully provided Alfonso with a legitimate heir, the future Peter the Round of Castile, who would later earn the nickname Peter the Cruel through methods that probably shouldn't surprise anyone familiar with his family history. Meanwhile, Leonor de Guzman was producing illegitimate children for Alfonso at an impressive rate, ultimately providing him with 10 bastard children while simultaneously receiving most of the royal affection, the best housing arrangements, and the majority of expensive gifts that should theoretically have been directed toward the official queen. After Alfonso's death finally freed Maria from her unhappy marriage, she returned to Portugal with her teenage son Peter and proceeded to do what any bitter, systematically sidelined queen might do under similar circumstances. She began clinging to her boy with the kind of obsessive intensity that combined emotional support with elaborate revenge planning. Historians, when they're being diplomatically polite, describe Maria's behavior toward her son as overprotective. The less diplomatically minded observers tend to raise their eyebrows significantly and point to the genuinely strange intensity of their relationship, which seemed to go far beyond normal maternal affection and move into territory that made courtiers uncomfortable. Peter eventually grew to adulthood, fell deeply in love, and married his longtime mistress, Inés de Castro, a woman who possessed both beauty and intelligence, but lacked the kind of high-level nobility that royal marriages typically required. Maria did not approve of this union, and her disapproval was both vocal and politically active. Some historical accounts suggest that Maria's objection to Inés was based on practical concerns about social class and the political implications of Peter marrying beneath his station. Other accounts hint that Maria's real problem was that she simply didn't want to share her son's emotional attention with any woman who wasn't herself, which raises questions about the psychological dynamics of their relationship that medieval chroniclers were reluctant to explore in detail. Either way, the situation escalated with remarkable speed and violence. According to one particularly dramatic version of these events, Maria actively encouraged and possibly orchestrated the assassination of Inés de Castro, viewing her son's wife as a threat that needed to be eliminated permanently. Peter's response to his wife's murder was exactly the kind of measured, rational reaction you might expect from someone with his family background and personal history. He declared Inés his wife posthumously, had her dead body exhumed and placed on the throne of Portugal, and then forced all the nobles in his court to kiss her rotting hand in formal acknowledgement of her royal status. This was, by any reasonable standard, a completely proportionate response to losing one's beloved wife to political assassination. Whether Maria actually masterminded Inés's killing remains a matter of historical debate, but her name was definitely whispered behind palace curtains for years afterward whenever people discussed the incident. The level of her involvement may never be known with certainty, but the fact that people immediately suspected her suggests that her reputation for ruthless possessiveness was well established throughout the Portuguese court. Later in life, Maria withdrew from active political involvement and may have begun referring to herself as Empress in private correspondence, though there was no legal or political basis for this title. There's no definitive proof that she suffered from complete mental breakdown, but she did spend considerable time staring out windows while writing letters that no one bothered to read, which suggests that her grip on reality may have become somewhat tenuous. Maria of Portugal never received the love and respect from her husband that she felt she deserved, but she did achieve a lifetime supply of palace intrigue, court gossip, and the dubious honor of being remembered by history as the archetypal mother-in-law from medieval hell, whose possessive love ultimately destroyed the people she claimed to care about most. Olga of Kiev, the saint who burned cities with pigeons. Olga of Kiev was decidedly not the kind of woman you wanted to cross lightly or moderately, or even accidentally glance at in a way that might be interpreted as disrespectful. When her husband, Prince Igor of Kiev, was brutally murdered by a neighboring Slavic tribe called the Drevlians in the year 945, they made what would prove to be a catastrophically poor decision. They assumed that Igor's widow would quietly accept their peace offering and agree to marry the Drevlian prince as part of a diplomatic solution to their conflict. The Drevlians apparently believed that the woman whose husband they had just tied to 2 bent trees and then ripped in half would be in an appropriately receptive mood for wedding negotiations and diplomatic discussions about territorial boundaries. This assumption demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of Olga's personality and her approach to conflict resolution. Olga listened to their marriage proposal with what appeared to be polite consideration, smiled graciously in the way that experienced rulers do when they're making important decisions, and told the Drevlian ambassadors that she would definitely consider their generous offer. Then, with the kind of systematic thoroughness that would have impressed professional military strategists, she proceeded to burn them all alive in increasingly creative ways. Her revenge campaign began when she invited the first group of Drevlian envoys to visit her court for formal negotiations. While the delegates relaxed comfortably in their boats after the river journey to Kiev, believing that they were about to conclude a successful diplomatic mission, Olga had them carried, boats and all, into a massive pit that had been prepared specifically for this purpose. The entire delegation was then buried alive, which sent a strong opening message about her attitude toward people who murdered her husband and then had the audacity to propose marriage as a solution. Still not satisfied with this level of response, Olga sent word back to the Drevlians requesting that they send additional noble suitors to demonstrate the seriousness of their marriage proposal. When the second group of distinguished ambassadors arrived at her court, she graciously offered them the use of a luxurious bathhouse so they could refresh themselves and make themselves presentable before meeting with her for formal discussions. Once the Drevlian nobles were comfortably inside the bathhouse and had presumably removed their clothing and weapons, Olga's soldiers locked all the doors from the outside and set the entire building on fire. The resulting conflagration was less of a diplomatic incident and more of a practical demonstration about why you shouldn't murder the spouses of people who have access to large amounts of flammable materials and loyal soldiers. Even after 2 spectacular acts of vengeance, Olga still wasn't finished making her point. She traveled personally to the Drevlian capital city, ostensibly to hold a proper funeral feast in honor of her late husband Igor, which seemed like a reasonable and traditional way to conclude their conflict. The Drevlians, who apparently hadn't learned anything from the fate of their previous diplomatic missions, threw an enormous party to celebrate what they assumed would be the end of hostilities between their peoples. Olga attended this feast as an honored guest, waited patiently for the Drevlians to drink themselves into a properly vulnerable state, and then gave a pre-arranged signal to her soldiers, who proceeded to kill approximately 5,000 of the party guests. This wasn't so much a funeral feast as it was a blood-splattered educational presentation about the long-term consequences of murdering princes from Kiev. But Olga's most famous and creative act of revenge was still to come. When the surviving Drevlians finally retreated to their fortified city and begged desperately for mercy, Olga appeared to show signs of reasonable compassion. She told them that she would be willing to end her siege and cease her campaign of systematic destruction if each household in the city would provide her with a modest tribute of 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows per family. The Drevlians, who were probably both relieved and confused by this surprisingly reasonable request, happily complied with what seemed like an extremely humane peace settlement. Birds were readily available, easy to catch, and represented a tribute that wouldn't bankrupt anyone or cause significant hardship for their community. Olga then demonstrated why she would later be remembered as one of history's most creative military strategists. She ordered her soldiers to tie small pieces of sulfur-soaked cloth to the legs of each bird, set these makeshift incendiary devices on fire, and then release all the birds simultaneously. The pigeons and sparrows, acting on completely natural instincts, immediately flew home to their nests, which were conveniently located in the barns, thatched roofs, and wooden houses throughout the Drevlian city. The result was a perfectly synchronized firestorm that consumed the entire city in a single, coordinated conflagration. Every building caught fire simultaneously, creating an inferno that was impossible to fight or escape. The whole urban area burned to the ground in what amounted to medieval biological warfare, delivered by an air force of flaming pigeons. This was destruction brought to you by Team Avian Vengeance, and it represented perhaps the most creative use of domestic birds in military history. After this spectacular demonstration of her tactical abilities and creative problem-solving skills, Olga eventually converted to Christianity and was later canonized as a saint by the Eastern Orthodox Church, which proves that even religious institutions have a sense of humor about the complex relationship between holy behavior and effective leadership. One day you're burning entire cities to the ground using weaponized pigeons as part of an elaborate revenge scheme. And the next thing you know, you're a canonized saint who is celebrated as a holy symbol of piety and wisdom. Olga's transformation from vengeful widow to religious icon demonstrates that medieval Christianity was considerably more flexible about violent behavior than many people realize. Olga didn't engage in subtle political maneuvering, sophisticated poisoning schemes, or whispered conspiracies in dark corridors. She simply identified problems and then annihilated them completely, using whatever resources were available. And somehow, despite this approach to conflict resolution, she still managed to make the official sainthood list, which suggests that medieval standards for holy behavior were fascinatingly different from modern expectations. Lucrezia Borgia, the Pope's daughter and Renaissance scandal incarnate. Lucrezia Borgia never technically wore a queen's crown on her head, but don't let that minor detail fool you into underestimating her historical importance. She ruled hearts, bedrooms, and suspiciously timed deaths with considerably more flair and effectiveness than most legitimate monarchs could manage, even with access to a full treasury and a standing army at their disposal. Born in 1480 to the notorious Borgia family, which already functioned as a red flag for anyone who valued their personal safety, Lucrezia was the acknowledged daughter of Pope Alexander VI. Yes, you read that correctly. She was the daughter of a pope, which should theoretically have been impossible given that Catholic priests are supposed to maintain vows of celibacy. However, the Borgias operated under their own creative interpretation of Catholic doctrine, which mostly involved nepotism, political manipulation, and what historians diplomatically describe as Renaissance-level thirst for power, money, and physical pleasure. Lucrezia was married off multiple times as part of various political alliances that served her family's interests, which was standard practice for daughters of powerful families. However, her husbands had a disturbing tendency to either die suddenly under mysterious circumstances, flee in terror to distant countries, or find themselves in extremely awkward legal situations that involved public discussions of their private lives. One particularly unfortunate husband, Giovanni Sforza, claimed that he was being pressured to annul their marriage due to non-consummation, which meant that the Borgia family was publicly declaring that he was completely inadequate in bed and couldn't satisfy Lucrezia's needs. The medieval equivalent of leaving a one-star review about someone's sexual performance, except with significantly more serious political and social consequences. The Borgias were definitely not known for their subtlety when it came to personal attacks or public humiliation tactics. And then there were the rumors that surrounded Lucrezia like expensive perfume, except considerably more scandalous and persistent. Medieval gossip didn't engage in subtle implications or careful suggestions. It sprinted directly into full-blown soap opera territory with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for people who had been drinking wine for several hours. According to various contemporary accounts and persistent legends, Lucrezia supposedly wore a hollow ring specifically designed to be filled with poison, which would allow her to eliminate inconvenient people during dinner parties or social gatherings. She was also rumored to have conducted an incestuous affair with her brother Cesare Borgia, who was himself a figure of considerable political importance and personal notoriety throughout Renaissance Italy. Perhaps most shocking of all, some rumors suggested that she had given birth to a child whose parentage was officially listed as unknown, but was whispered to involve either her brother Cesare or possibly even Pope Alexander VI himself. These weren't subtle medieval hints or careful diplomatic language. These were accusations that would have made even the most jaded Renaissance courtiers raise their eyebrows and reach for stronger wine. Was any of this actually true? Probably not, but that didn't prevent the stories from spreading throughout Europe like wildfire. The Borgia family name had become synonymous with corruption, violence, and sexual excess, which meant that any rumor about them, no matter how outrageous, found a ready audience of people who were prepared to believe the worst. Lucrezia was universally acknowledged to be beautiful, highly intelligent, fluent in multiple languages, and possessed remarkable skill at organizing social events that people still talked about years later. In 15th century Rome, this meant parties that combined religious ceremonies, political networking, intellectual discussion, artistic patronage, and quite possibly a moderate amount of light homicide for entertainment value, depending on who had annoyed the Pope that particular week. Despite all the chaos and scandal that surrounded her family name, Lucrezia eventually settled into a considerably quieter and more conventional life as the Duchess of Ferrara. She managed a successful ducal court, provided generous support to Renaissance artists and writers, and spent significantly more time reading poetry than plotting murders, which was almost disappointing for people who had become accustomed to the constant drama of her earlier life. It was rather like watching a notoriously fierce lion decide to take up gardening as a hobby, admirable in its own way, but lacking the excitement that had made her previous activities so compelling to observe from a safe distance. However, the legend of Lucrezia Borgia never faded, regardless of how peacefully she spent her later years. The Borgia family name continued to drip with scandal and intrigue for centuries after their deaths, and she remained the most glamorous and mysterious figure associated with their legacy. Lucrezia represented the perfect combination of historical reality and carefully cultivated myth, with enough ambiguity to keep historians and storytellers arguing about her true character for centuries to come. In the end, Lucrezia's greatest weapon wasn't poison or seduction, though she may have been skilled at both. Her most powerful tool was ambiguity itself, the ability to remain mysterious and unknowable even when surrounded by the most sophisticated and cynical people in Renaissance Europe. And history, as it always does when faced with a beautiful and dangerous woman, absolutely devoured every rumor, story, and speculation about her life. Wu Zetian, the only female emperor of China. Wu Zetian began her remarkable imperial career following the most traditional path available to beautiful young women in Tang Dynasty China. She became a teenage concubine to Emperor Taizong, joining a large group of other attractive young women whose primary job was to be pretty, polite, and quietly observant. However, Wu approached this role with the kind of long-term strategic thinking that treated imperial service like a complex board game with no official rulebook and extremely high stakes. When Emperor Taizong died, Wu, like all concubines who hadn't produced children, was sent to a Buddhist convent according to established custom. She was expected to live out the remainder of her days in quiet religious reflection, contemplating the transient nature of worldly power and accepting her fate with appropriate Buddhist detachment. Wu reflected on her situation thoughtfully, developed some innovative plans, and then re-emerged from religious life with upgraded ambitions and significantly fewer illusions about the nature of imperial loyalty or family bonds. Through a combination of remarkable timing, strategic intelligence, and probably a fair amount of luck, she managed to catch the romantic attention of the next emperor, Gaozong, who happened to be the son of her former imperial patron. Yes, Wu successfully seduced her deceased lover's son, which was exactly as awkward and politically complicated as it sounds, but also impressively effective as a career advancement strategy. She returned to the imperial court with considerably more experience, much clearer goals, and absolutely no intention of remaining a minor concubine for the rest of her life. Wu had learned important lessons during her temporary religious retirement, and she was prepared to apply this knowledge systematically and ruthlessly. Once she had established herself as Empress Wu, she began clearing the imperial court of potential threats and rivals with the kind of methodical efficiency that people usually associate with spring cleaning, except with significantly more execution warrants and suspicious disappearances. Political rivals were systematically removed from power through exile, imprisonment, or permanent solutions. Threats to her authority were eliminated before they could develop into serious problems. Even members of her own family weren't safe from her suspicious attention. Wu was rumored to have smothered her own infant daughter specifically to frame the previous empress for the crime, which demonstrates that she wasn't particularly sentimental about family relationships when they interfered with her political objectives. This might sound extremely callous by modern standards, but Wu didn't engage in subtle political maneuvering or half measures. She preferred decisive action that produced clear, permanent results, Eventually, when Emperor Gaozong fell seriously ill and became unable to fulfill his imperial duties effectively, Wu began ruling through him, around him, and increasingly in spite of him. After his death, she made her most audacious political move. Instead of serving as regent for one of her sons or stepping aside in favor of a male relative, Wu declared herself Emperor of China in her own right. She didn't rule from behind a curtain or through intermediaries or by manipulating male relatives. She sat directly on the dragon throne, wore the imperial robes without apology, signed government decrees with her own hand, and held court as the official son of heaven, despite being obviously female. The Confucian scholars and government bureaucrats had collective nervous breakdowns at this unprecedented violation of cosmic order. Wu ignored their complaints completely and continued running the empire. Under her direct rule, the Tang Empire flourished in ways that impressed even her harshest critics. Agricultural production increased significantly, educational opportunities expanded throughout the kingdom, the civil service examination system was reformed and improved, and trade relationships with neighboring countries strengthened considerably. However, the number of accidental deaths among court officials also rose dramatically, and political dissidents had a disturbing tendency to become mysteriously silent about their complaints. The rumors about Wu's personal life were as dramatic as everything else associated with her reign. Accusations included maintaining secret lovers who were significantly younger than appropriate for an empress, using sexual manipulation to control government officials, ordering murders through what were euphemistically called golden boxes that contained execution commands, and hosting elaborate orgies in the imperial palace that combined political networking with recreational activities. Were any of these stories actually true? It's impossible to know for certain, but in a culture where a woman holding ultimate political power was considered so unnatural that it required supernatural explanations, people reasoned that Wu couldn't possibly be governing successfully through mere competence. It had to be sex magic, or demonic influence, or some other form of otherworldly intervention. Wu completely ignored all the speculation about her methods and continued ruling China effectively for over 40 years, which was remarkable not just for an empress, but for any ruler during that historical period. She died peacefully in her 80s, having outlasted most of her enemies, critics, and probably several different generations of gossipy courtiers who had spent decades trying to figure out her secrets. Wu Zetian proved that political effectiveness could overcome social conventions, that intelligence and determination could triumph over traditional gender expectations, and that sometimes the most radical thing a woman could do was simply refuse to apologize for her own competence and ambition. Queen Tamar of Georgia, the King of Kings. Queen Tamar of Georgia ruled during what historians enthusiastically call the Georgian Golden Age, a period of unprecedented prosperity, territorial expansion, and cultural achievement. However, if you choose to believe the elaborate compositions of her court poets, her reign was also a time of spiritual enlightenment, epic military victories, and what can only be described as extremely poetic pillow talk that inspired some of the most passionate literature in medieval history. Crowned with the impressive title of King of Kings in 1184, rather than the more conventional Queen, Tamar made it immediately clear that she wasn't content to serve as merely a decorative royal accessory to whatever husband her nobles might choose for her. She styled herself as the sovereign ruler of Georgia in her own right, not just the royal wife who happened to wear a crown during ceremonial occasions. When her nobles attempted to arrange a politically convenient marriage for her, Tamar responded with characteristic independence. She politely selected Yuri Bogolyubsky, a Russian prince who possessed impressive political connections, a serious drinking problem, and questionable personal hygiene habits that made court life challenging for everyone involved. She married him according to diplomatic expectations, tolerated his behavior for an appropriate period of time, and then promptly exiled him from Georgia when his conduct became insufferable, which happened fairly quickly. After disposing of her first inconvenient husband, Tamar decided to rule solo for a while, which gave her the opportunity to focus on what she did best, expanding Georgian territory through successful military campaigns, managing a flourishing economy that made her neighbors envious, and patronizing court poets who produced literary works in such vast quantities that they could have flooded the Black Sea with verses about love, loyalty, and the divine radiance of their glorious queen's remarkable cheekbones. This is where Tamar's story becomes particularly interesting and perhaps just a little bit romantically charged. Her court poets, most notably the celebrated Shota Rustaveli, created epic romantic literature so passionately devoted to Queen Tamar that modern scholars have definitely raised their eyebrows and asked pointed questions about the exact nature of their relationship. Rustaveli's masterpiece, The Knight in the Panther's Skin, tells the elaborate story of a powerful queen who rules over all men with divine authority, inspires blind devotion among her followers, and may or may not bear a remarkable resemblance to Queen Tamar herself, except with slightly more metaphorical language and considerably more references to hunting large cats. Of course, none of this literary evidence proves anything definitive about Tamar's private life, but rumors do persist through medieval Georgian sources like aromatic smoke that no one wants to identify directly. Whispers about private retreats in mountain palaces, discreet romantic companions who may have included both men and women, and late-night conversations that supposedly didn't involve discussions of tax policy or military strategy float through historical accounts with the kind of delicate persistence that suggests there was more to Tamar's court than official diplomatic records were willing to document. Medieval chroniclers, being products of their time and culture, were naturally reluctant to speculate too directly about their sovereign's romantic arrangements, especially when that sovereign was both remarkably successful as a ruler and quite capable of having inconvenient historians relocated to distant monasteries for extended periods of spiritual reflection. Despite all the literary flirtations and historical innuendo, Queen Tamar was eventually canonized as a saint after her death, which is particularly impressive considering that her reign included leading military crusades against neighboring kingdoms, crushing several internal rebellions with considerable violence, and allegedly sending former lovers to remote religious communities when their presence at court became politically inconvenient or personally awkward. She managed to die peacefully in her bed, surrounded by loyal nobles and armed with enough theological justification to make even the most romantically charged rumors fade quietly into the realm of poetic speculation rather than historical scandal. Queen Tamar didn't need scandal or romantic controversy to be remembered by history. Her political and military achievements were impressive enough to ensure her lasting fame. However, the tantalizing possibility of passionate love affairs hidden beneath layers of medieval diplomatic discretion is exactly what keeps her story fascinating to modern audiences who enjoy wondering about the private lives of powerful historical figures. Tamar proved that sometimes the most intriguing historical mysteries aren't about what definitely happened, but about what might have happened behind closed doors in mountain palaces where even the walls were sworn to secrecy. Medieval Christmas, the 12 days of sanctioned chaos. If you think Christmas ends on December 25th, you would have been laughed right out of any medieval tavern in Europe. Back then, Christmas was just the opening ceremony for what would become 12 full days of religiously sanctioned madness, lasting from the Nativity on December 25th all the way through the Feast of the Epiphany on January 6th. Each of those 12 days carried its own specific meaning, established customs, and socially acceptable excuses for indulgence that would have made modern party planners weep with envy. The first day, Christmas itself, was appropriately solemn and sacred, featuring midnight masses, religious processions, and the kind of reverent behavior that reminded everyone why they were celebrating in the first place. However, don't let the incense and hymn singing fool you into thinking the entire season was going to be quietly pious. After weeks of Advent, which was essentially medieval Lent, but with fewer available snacks and considerably more waiting around for something interesting to happen, Christmas unleashed a flood of feasting, music, and merrymaking that could rival any modern festival. During these 12 days, the poor finally got permission to eat meat after months of subsisting on porridge and vegetables. The wealthy threw banquets so extravagant they could have bankrupted small monasteries, and probably did. The ale and wine flowed like major European rivers, and everyone from peasants to nobles participated in the kind of celebration that modern health experts would find deeply concerning. The 12 days weren't simply an extended dinner party with religious decorations. They were simultaneously spiritual, theatrical, and frankly chaotic in ways that combined the sacred and the ridiculous. Each individual day had different saints to honor, which provided structure to the festivities while also offering convenient excuses for specific types of misbehavior. December 26th was St. Stephen's Day, dedicated to charitable giving and providing food to the poor. Think of it as the historical predecessor to Boxing Day, except with considerably more piety and significantly fewer commercial sales events. This was when wealthy households would distribute leftover food, old clothing, and small amounts of money to local peasants who had spent the year working on their lands. December 28th was Holy Innocents' Day, commemorating the children killed by King Herod in his attempt to eliminate the infant Jesus. Some medieval communities marked this solemn occasion with a tradition that was either charming or terrifying depending on your perspective. Children were actually allowed to rule their households for the entire day. Yes, medieval parents voluntarily handed authority over to their offspring, and this arrangement invariably ended about as well as you might expect, but it was enthusiastically repeated every single year. By the time January 1st arrived, celebrating the Feast of the Circumcision, most participants were too exhausted from 11 consecutive days of partying, too full from constant feasting, and too intoxicated from regular wine consumption to do much more than stumble through Latin hymns while clutching roasted goose legs and hoping they could survive until Epiphany. But medieval Europeans were remarkably resilient when it came to sustained celebration, and they managed to push through to January 6th, which marked Epiphany and the visit of the Magi to the infant Christ. This final day brought Twelfth Night into full swing, featuring elaborate masquerades, costume parties, and the kind of role reversal activities where peasants played kings and actual kings pretended to enjoy being mocked by their social inferiors. For medieval people, Christmas wasn't a single morning of gift exchange, followed by a large dinner and family arguments. It was nearly 2 full weeks that blended sacred devotion with rowdy excess and social topsy-turvy behavior that would have scandalized people during any other time of year. If you weren't still celebrating well into the new year, your neighbors would have questioned whether you were really taking the birth of Christ seriously enough. Medieval Christmas decorations, pagan symbols, and severed pig heads. Forget everything you think you know about traditional Christmas decorations involving pine trees, plastic Santa figures, and elaborate light displays that can be seen from orbit. A medieval Christmas celebration looked considerably more like a pagan woodland festival that had been temporarily sanctified by the church than anything resembling modern holiday decor. Instead of artificial tinsel and mass-produced ornaments, medieval households decorated their homes with ivy, holly, bay leaves, and mistletoe. Basically, if a plant stayed green during the brutal winter months, it was getting hung from every available surface in the house. These evergreen plants symbolized eternal life and resilience in the face of death, concepts that medieval people found deeply meaningful during the darkest time of year. The symbolic significance was deliberately chosen and carefully maintained. Holly, with its sharp, pointed leaves that could draw blood if handled carelessly, was thought to represent the crown of thorns that Christ wore during his crucifixion. Ivy, which clung tenaciously to surfaces and spread aggressively across any available space, symbolized the faithful Christian's complete dependence on God's grace and mercy. Mistletoe occupied a somewhat more controversial position in medieval Christmas decoration. This plant was associated with fertility, romance, and ancient Norse mythology in ways that made church authorities distinctly uncomfortable. The pagan connections were obvious and problematic, but mistletoe was too popular with common people to be completely banned. The church authorities didn't enthusiastically approve of mistletoe use, but they also couldn't realistically prevent people from hanging it in their homes. The tradition of kissing under mistletoe wasn't always entirely consensual by modern standards. Medieval custom dictated that anyone standing beneath hanging mistletoe could be kissed, often forcibly, regardless of their personal preferences in the matter. The church definitely didn't love this particular tradition, but medieval people continued practicing it anyway, because even religious authorities had to pick their battles carefully when it came to popular customs. However, the true centerpiece of medieval Christmas decoration wasn't any type of plant. It was the boar's head, served not just as the main course for dinner, but as the primary decorative focal point for the entire celebration. Picture this scene carefully. A fully roasted pig's head, complete with an apple stuffed in its mouth, paraded ceremoniously into the great hall on an expensive silver platter, while professional minstrels sang the Boar's Head Carol at the top of their lungs. Because apparently nothing says peace on earth and goodwill toward men, quite like a severed animal head making direct eye contact with your dinner guests while Christmas music plays in the background. This wasn't considered macabre or inappropriate by medieval standards. The boar's head represented abundance, prosperity, and the triumph of good over evil, since wild boars were considered dangerous beasts that threatened livestock and crops. Successfully hunting and serving a boar demonstrated both courage and the ability to provide for one's household during the harsh winter months. Medieval great halls during Christmas looked nothing like modern living rooms. These were enormous spaces that echoed with the sounds of lutes, pipes, drums, and the occasional intoxicated monk attempting to sing Christmas hymns after consuming too much spiced wine. The floors were covered with fresh rushes instead of carpets. The walls were adorned with expensive tapestries that told religious or mythological stories, and the air was filled with the mingled aromas of roasted meat, spiced wine, and unwashed bodies that had been celebrating for several consecutive days. The overall effect was part holy sanctuary, part forest clearing, and part medieval nightclub, depending on how late in the evening you encountered it. Evergreen branches hung from wooden rafters like natural chandeliers. Dozens of candles flickered on long wooden tables that groaned under the weight of food. And somewhere in the organized chaos, someone was always trying to remember which corner contained the mistletoe and which corner had been designated for the chamber pot. If you had walked into a medieval manor house during the 12 days of Christmas, the sensory experience would have been overwhelming. The visual impact of green decorations against stone walls, the constant sound of music and laughter, the rich smells of feast food and wine, and the palpable excitement of people who were participating in the most important celebration of their entire year. Medieval Christmas feasting, edible declarations of power. Medieval Christmas feasting wasn't simply about having a nice meal with family and friends. It was an elaborate edible theater performance that declared your social status, demonstrated your wealth and generosity, and proved your ability to provide abundance during the harshest season of the year. For the nobility, Christmas dinner was an opportunity to show off their economic power through a parade of dishes so absurdly over the top that they bordered on culinary performance art. For medieval peasants, Christmas represented the one time of year when they might actually taste real meat, instead of subsisting on their usual diet of porridge, cabbage, and whatever vegetables they had managed to preserve through the winter months. This wasn't entirely irrational behavior, given that plague outbreaks and famine were constant threats that could eliminate entire communities without warning. When you faced the possibility that this Christmas might be your last, it made sense to eat like the world was ending, because it very well might be. The star of any respectable noble feast was often the boar's head, but that was merely the opening act in a culinary production that would make modern celebrity chefs weep with envy and exhaustion. Wealthy households served roasted peacock that was presented in its own iridescent feathers, as if the bird had simply decided to lie down on the serving platter while maintaining its full plumage. Swan was glazed with expensive spices that cost more than most peasants earned in a year. Enormous meat pies were constructed so large that they could literally hide live birds inside them, and frequently did. These weren't just rumors or exaggerations. There are documented accounts of dinner entertainment that involved opening massive pastries to release small birds that would fly around the dining hall while guests cheered and tried to avoid being struck by panicked songbirds. Medieval cooks created elaborate edible sculptures called subtleties, made from marzipan, sugar, or specially prepared dough that was shaped and painted to resemble castles, angels, dragons, or mythological creatures. These weren't simple decorations, they were architectural achievements in food form that required skilled artisans and considerable time to complete. The variety of dishes served at a single Christmas feast could include multiple types of roasted meats, thick stews loaded with root vegetables, half-baked bread that was dense enough to serve as a weapon if necessary, sweet meats that combined honey with various spices, pottages that were essentially medieval casseroles, and subtleties that were designed to impress guests before being consumed. Let's not forget about the beverages, which were just as important as the food for maintaining the proper festive atmosphere. Wassail was a hot-spiced ale or cider that was passed around in communal bowls, with everyone drinking from the same vessel while wishing each other good health. The word wassail literally meant be well, or be in good health, but the practical effect was usually the exact opposite, since sharing drinks from communal bowls wasn't exactly hygienic by any standard. Another popular drink was hippocras, which was spiced wine that had been sweetened with honey and served warm to help guests digest the massive quantities of rich food they were expected to consume. These beverages weren't just festive additions to the meal, they were functionally necessary. After weeks of Advent fasting, people's stomachs needed chemical assistance to handle the sudden influx of goose fat, roasted meats, and heavy pastries. But these elaborate feasts weren't casual buffet arrangements where people could wander around filling their plates according to personal preference. Medieval Christmas dinners were carefully choreographed performances with strict rules about social hierarchy, seating arrangements, and service order. High-status guests were served first and seated closest to the fire, which was both an honor and a practical consideration during winter celebrations in stone buildings without central heating. Lower-ranking attendees received whatever food remained after their social superiors had been satisfied, unless the celebration was taking place at a monastery, where Christian principles of equality were supposed to govern the distribution of food. However, even monks had been known to break their usual vegetarian rules during Christmas, because apparently the birth of Jesus provided sufficient theological justification for consuming leg of mutton and large quantities of wine. Food was absolutely central to medieval Christmas celebrations because it represented one of the few times during the year when people had access to such abundance and variety. For most of the year, even wealthy people subsisted on relatively monotonous diets of preserved meats, stored grains, and whatever vegetables could survive winter storage. Christmas was the moment when the social contract temporarily agreed that everyone deserved to eat until they were uncomfortably full, regardless of their normal economic circumstances. If you thought hosting one elaborate feast was sufficient for Christmas celebration, medieval people would have considered you an amateur who didn't understand the true spirit of the season. Each of the 12 days featured its own meal, often with its own host, and frequently with its own thematic focus. By the time Epiphany arrived on January 6th, most celebrants were spiritually uplifted, emotionally exhausted, and physically bloated to the point where normal clothing no longer fit properly. The Lord of Misrule, Medieval Christmas Chaos Management. If you think modern Christmas celebrations can get a little chaotic with family arguments and overcooked turkey, medieval people would have looked at your holiday stress and said, "Hold our wassail cups and watch this." Enter the Lord of Misrule, an actual official position that was often filled by a court fool, a household servant, or some mischievous cleric who had been specifically chosen to oversee the Christmas festivities and ensure that everything remained appropriately inappropriate for the duration of the 12 days. The Lord of Misrule was essentially the human embodiment of holiday madness, tasked with turning the established social order completely upside down and making everything delightfully chaotic in ways that would have given modern event planners severe anxiety attacks. His primary job responsibility was to preside over licensed anarchy that was wrapped in festive decorations and justified by religious tradition. During his temporary reign, the Lord of Misrule might hold mock court sessions where people were formally tried for ridiculous crimes like stealing sausages from the kitchen, wearing an inappropriately ugly hat to church services, or failing to sing Christmas carols with sufficient enthusiasm. His court was populated by jesters, musicians, and other professional agents of mischief who were specifically employed to make everything as absurd as possible. This wasn't simply tolerated chaos, it was ritualized anarchy that had been sanctioned by both religious and secular authorities. Medieval people genuinely believed that temporarily flipping the social order served important psychological and spiritual purposes. The theory was that hierarchies could be reinforced more effectively if people were allowed to release social tension for 12 days, so the remaining 353 days of the year could proceed with appropriate order and obedience. During the Lord of Misrule's reign, established hierarchies were not just questioned, they were completely reversed for entertainment purposes. Servants gave orders to their masters with impunity. Students were encouraged to punish their teachers for imaginary offenses. Choir boys dressed as bishops and delivered mock sermons that were both theologically questionable and absolutely hilarious to medieval audiences. Even monasteries and churches weren't immune to this temporary insanity. Some religious communities elected a boy bishop on December 6th, St. Nicholas Day, who would lead religious processions and deliver sermons that were performed by children who could barely pronounce complex theological terms. This wasn't considered sacrilegious, it was viewed as symbolically meaningful. The innocence and wisdom of children were considered closer to divine truth than the complicated theology of adult scholars. Also, watching a 12-year-old attempt to pronounce incarnation while wearing oversized bishop's robes was apparently hilarious enough to justify the temporary disruption of normal religious services. The Lord of Misrule actively encouraged wild dancing, competitive drinking games, and the wearing of bizarre costumes that would have been scandalous during any other time of year. In noble courts, people wore animal masks that transformed them into various beasts, engaged in cross-dressing that confused gender roles, or dressed as devils, saints, or biblical figures. Often all three costume categories were represented simultaneously in the same room, creating visual chaos that was both entertaining and slightly disturbing. Think of it as medieval Halloween, combined with a Christmas celebration, and managed by someone whose job description specifically required them to make everything as weird and wonderful as humanly possible. The goal was to create an atmosphere where normal social rules were not just relaxed, they were completely abandoned in favor of pure festive anarchy. Of course, the church had complicated feelings about all this organized chaos. Some clergy members tried to establish limits on the festivities, especially when the celebrations became too sexually explicit or theologically inappropriate for comfort. However, most religious authorities understood that medieval life was brutal, short, and filled with constant hardship. Allowing people to completely lose their minds for 12 days helped prevent them from losing their sanity permanently during the other 50 weeks of the year. Even bishops occasionally enjoyed watching servants boss around nobles and listening to children deliver sermons about religious topics they didn't fully understand. Plus, medieval fruitcake was apparently just as dense and potentially dangerous as modern versions, so everyone needed some kind of entertainment to distract them from the food. While modern people might stress over holiday decorations, gift shopping, and awkward family dinners, medieval celebrants had a designated professional whose entire mission was to make Christmas as weird, wild, and upside down as humanly possible. The Lord of Misrule's job was to ensure that social conventions were thoroughly mocked, authority figures were appropriately humiliated, and everyone had permission to behave like completely different people for nearly 2 weeks. Medieval caroling, festive extortion with musical accompaniment. If a group of medieval carolers appeared at your front door today, you would probably immediately call security, the police, and possibly animal control, depending on what they were carrying. Medieval caroling bore absolutely no resemblance to the gentle, harmonious hymn singing that we associate with modern Christmas traditions. Instead, it was considerably more like festive extortion performed by groups of intoxicated peasants who were brandishing drinking vessels and possibly carrying live geese for reasons that were never entirely clear. Picture this scene carefully. A group of medieval villagers who had been celebrating for several consecutive days, bellowing traditional songs at maximum volume while waving tankards of ale and making demands for hospitality that were simultaneously cheerful and vaguely threatening. They weren't requesting your attendance at a peaceful religious service. They were essentially conducting a musical shakedown operation that combined Christmas spirit with low-grade economic coercion. The term carol originally referred to a circular dance that was accompanied by singing, and many Christmas carols began their existence as completely secular folk songs with lyrics that were occasionally inappropriate for religious settings. Over time, these songs were gradually adopted, rewritten, or sanitized by church authorities to reflect more pious themes and acceptable theological content. However, Even the most devoutly religious carolers understood that singing was only half of their traditional responsibilities. The other half of caroling involved wassailing, which was the primary vehicle for this festive extortion system. Groups of carolers would travel systematically from house to house, singing songs and offering toasts with hot mulled cider or ale that had been prepared specifically for the occasion. In return for this musical and alcoholic presentation, they expected to receive food, drink, money, or some combination of all three. If you failed to provide appropriate compensation for their caroling services, the singers might continue performing outside your windows at increased volume levels, or worse yet, they might begin improvising additional verses about your stinginess, cheapness, and general failure to embody proper Christmas spirit. Yes, these medieval performers were essentially the historical equivalent of Yelp reviewers, except armed with musical instruments, alcoholic beverages, and the social authority to shame you publicly for inadequate hospitality. This system of musical coercion wasn't simply tolerated by medieval society, it was actively expected and encouraged. Noble households typically prepared food and drink in advance specifically for passing carolers, understanding that welcoming these roving musicians was both a social obligation and a form of community insurance. Peasant families saw caroling as a rare opportunity to visit their social superiors and maybe obtain a few meat pies or cups of wine that wouldn't normally be available to them. There was even a ritualistic element to these interactions that went beyond simple economic exchange. People genuinely believed that welcoming carolers and sharing food with them brought good luck and divine blessings for the upcoming year. Conversely, slamming doors in carolers' faces or refusing to provide hospitality was considered not just rude, but potentially dangerous to your family's future prosperity. Poor harvests and financial difficulties were sometimes blamed on inadequate Christmas generosity because medieval people took the connection between hospitality and divine favor very seriously. The songs themselves varied considerably in both quality and content. Some carolers performed traditional religious hymns about the nativity story, others sang verses dedicated to various saints who were associated with Christmas celebrations, and many groups specialized in drinking songs that were tangentially related to the holiday season. One particularly popular favorite was "Bring Us in Good Ale," which featured a chorus that, shockingly, requested good ale with considerable enthusiasm and repetitive insistence. Another classic performance piece was the Boar's Head Carol, which was traditionally sung while a roasted pig's head was carried triumphantly into the dining hall like a meaty trophy that everyone was expected to admire and eventually consume. The lyrics celebrated the successful hunting of dangerous wild boars while simultaneously preparing the audience for the main course of their Christmas dinner. So while modern caroling represents a quaint and peaceful nod to historical tradition, medieval caroling was essentially a combination of community ritual, organized bar crawl, and low-grade protection racket that involved musical performances. And this tradition wasn't limited strictly to the 12 days of Christmas, it often extended well into January, depending on how much alcohol people still had available and how long they could maintain the energy required for systematic house-to-house musical performances. Medieval carolers understood that Christmas spirit was best expressed through a combination of religious devotion, community solidarity, and the kind of persistent cheerfulness that was impossible to ignore, especially when it was accompanied by loud singing and implicit threats of continued loud singing until appropriate compensation was provided. The Yule log, medieval fire safety anxiety. Before modern homes had scented candles, electric fireplaces, and central heating systems that could be controlled with smartphone apps, there was the Yule log, a massive piece of timber that was dragged ceremoniously into the Great Hall and set ablaze with the kind of religious ceremony usually reserved for coronations or major religious festivals. The Yule log wasn't simply about staying warm during winter, though warmth was definitely appreciated. It was a deeply symbolic tradition that combined practical heating with spiritual protection and enough fire safety anxiety to keep everyone alert throughout the celebration. Medieval Yule logs were so enormously large that most houses couldn't accommodate them entirely within their fireplaces. Families would literally shove one end of the log into the hearth and leave the other end sticking out into the room like a flaming breadstick of seasonal joy that posed constant threats to clothing, furniture, and anyone who had consumed too much was stale and lost track of their spatial awareness. As the log burned slowly over the course of several days, household members would gradually push it further into the fire, creating a continuous source of heat and light that required constant attention and management. This wasn't simply a practical heating solution. The Yule log carried deep symbolic significance that was rooted in traditions that were suspiciously pagan in origin. Medieval people believed that the log possessed the power to ward off evil spirits, bring good fortune to the household, and even predict future events based on how the flames flickered, danced, and changed color throughout the burning process. The ashes that remained after the log was completely consumed were carefully saved and used for various purposes. They were spread on agricultural fields to improve fertility, kept in homes to provide protection against lightning strikes, and sometimes mixed with other ingredients to create folk remedies for various ailments. Yes, medieval people genuinely believed that burning wood ashes could protect them from lightning strikes. Medieval logic was often a fascinating combination of practical wisdom, religious faith, and magical thinking that doesn't always make sense to modern minds, but was completely logical within the context of their understanding of how the world worked. Lighting the Yule log was considered a significant ceremonial event that required careful attention to traditional procedures. Often, families would use embers that had been saved from the previous year's Yule log to ignite the new one, creating a symbolic continuity that connected each Christmas celebration to all the previous celebrations in the family's history. This tradition represented prosperity, stability, and the kind of fire safety planning that resulted from centuries of experience with large indoor fires. Using completely new fire to light the Yule log was considered extremely bad luck, similar to hitting the shuffle button on your family's Destiny playlist when everyone preferred the familiar songs. The slow, steady burn that resulted from proper lighting techniques was considered essential for the log's effectiveness as both a heat source and a spiritual protection device. The log itself was selected with considerable care and advanced planning. Sometimes entire trees were chosen specifically for Christmas celebrations and cut down with appropriate ceremony months before the holiday season began. Wealthy households might decorate their Yule logs with ribbons, evergreen branches, or even dust them with expensive wine as part of the preparation ritual. The goal was to create a log that was impressive enough to burn steadily throughout all 12 nights of Christmas, because premature extinction was considered a terrible omen for the coming year. If the Yule log went out too early, medieval families worried about potential disasters ranging from crop failures to livestock diseases to various forms of supernatural revenge that might result from inadequate Christmas fire management. Hope you didn't have any strong emotional attachment to your farm animals, because apparently they were at risk if your log didn't burn properly. Gathering around the Yule log became the focal point for most evening Christmas activities. Families would drink wassail, sing traditional songs, tell stories that had been passed down through previous generations, and roast chestnuts over the flames. Children were entertained with cautionary tales about supernatural creatures that might crawl down the chimney if they misbehaved during the Christmas season, while adults passed around mugs of spiced wine and engaged in the kind of gossip that made long winter nights more bearable. The Yule log transformed the hearth into both the literal and metaphorical center of Christmas celebrations, creating warmth and light that supported community gathering during the darkest time of the year. It represented the triumph of human planning and preparation over winter's natural hostility, while also serving as a focus for hopes, prayers, and wishes for the coming year. Though the Yule log tradition has mostly disappeared from modern celebrations, except in cake form that poses significantly fewer fire hazards, it once symbolized the medieval combination of practical necessity, spiritual hope, and community solidarity that made Christmas celebrations meaningful during an era when survival itself required constant effort and attention. The Yule log was essentially the medieval equivalent of gathering around a crackling fireplace while streaming holiday movies, except with considerably more religious significance, supernatural protection, and genuine concern about accidentally setting the house on fire. Medieval Christmas gifts and games, walnuts, and competitive violence. When it comes to Christmas gift-giving, medieval people would have been completely baffled by modern concepts like wrapping paper, shipping deadlines, and Amazon wish lists that require advanced engineering degrees to navigate successfully. Gift exchange did exist during medieval Christmas celebrations, but it wasn't the central commercial event that dominates contemporary holidays, and it certainly didn't occur on Christmas Day itself, which would have seemed like peculiar timing to people who understood the proper sequence of Christmas traditions. Gift-giving typically took place on New Year's Day or during Epiphany on January 6th, depending on local customs and which saints the community was trying to impress with their generosity. The timing was considered important because it connected the gifts to different aspects of the Christmas story and provided multiple opportunities for celebration throughout the 12-day season. Medieval people also had very different ideas about appropriate gift-giving than modern consumers who have been trained to expect elaborate presentations and expensive surprises. Forget the concept of one major present that demonstrates the giver's deep affection and financial resources. Medieval gifts were typically symbolic rather than extravagant, meaningful rather than costly, and practical rather than impressive. A noble might give a trained falcon to a fellow aristocrat, which was simultaneously a generous gesture and a practical tool for hunting that could provide food throughout the coming year. Books were considered extremely valuable gifts, since they were hand-copied manuscripts that required months of careful work to produce. A servant might receive a pair of gloves to keep their hands warm during winter work, food that would supplement their normal diet, or if they were particularly fortunate, a few coins that could be saved for future emergencies. Children received gifts that would seem modest by contemporary standards: nuts, apples, or small wooden toys that had been carved by local craftsmen. There were definitely no gold-plated gaming systems or electronic devices that required separate instruction manuals and technical support services. Medieval children were expected to be grateful for a handful of walnuts and maybe a wooden horse that could be used for both play and target practice. However, while medieval gifts were relatively simple, the games and entertainment during the 12 days of Christmas were elaborate, competitive, and occasionally violent in ways that would concern modern safety inspectors and insurance companies. The medieval approach to Christmas entertainment was based on the principle that if an activity didn't involve some combination of competition, mild physical danger, or theatrical performance, it probably wasn't festive enough to qualify as appropriate holiday fun. Popular games included Hoodman Blind, which was essentially a medieval version of Blind Man's Bluff, except with more opportunities for accidental injury. Hot Cockles involved blindfolding participants and encouraging them to slap each other, which doesn't require much additional explanation about why it was entertaining to medieval audiences. Wrestling matches were common entertainment, and they frequently ended with someone unconscious in a ditch, which was considered a successful conclusion rather than a cause for medical concern. If a Christmas activity involved competition, mild violence, theatrical flair, or preferably all three simultaneously, it was automatically approved for holiday entertainment. Medieval people believed that celebrations should be memorable, and the best way to ensure memorability was through activities that carried genuine risk of embarrassment, injury, or public humiliation. Board games also occupied an important place in Christmas entertainment. Chess was extremely popular among the nobility, partly because it provided intellectual stimulation and partly because it could be played while consuming large quantities of ale without requiring physical coordination. Alquerque, which was a precursor to modern checkers, was another favorite pastime that could accommodate drinking and still produce clear winners and losers. However, even these more civilized games were often played with heavy drinking involved, which explains why medieval chessboards were frequently discovered under tables rather than being displayed in their proper positions. Apparently, strategic thinking and wassail consumption were not entirely compatible activities. For people who preferred theatrical entertainment to competitive games, there were mummers' plays, which were masked performances put on by roving groups of amateur actors who traveled from household to household during the Christmas season. These were chaotic, semi-improvised dramatic productions that often involved themes of death and resurrection, battles with dragons, encounters with saints, and the occasional dancing devil who provided comic relief. Think of mummers' plays as medieval soap operas written and performed by your most intoxicated relatives, with costumes borrowed from whatever materials were available and scripts that changed depending on how much the actors had been drinking and whether they could remember their lines from the previous performance. The performances were meant to be both entertaining and spiritually meaningful, combining religious themes with folk traditions in ways that satisfied both church authorities and audiences who wanted to be entertained rather than lectured. The quality varied considerably, but enthusiasm was usually sufficient to compensate for any deficiencies in artistic execution. Other popular Christmas entertainments included charades, riddle contests, and competitive storytelling that often continued late into the night. Losing participants might be required to consume additional ale, recite embarrassing poetry, or wear ridiculous accessories like pig snouts tied to their noses with string, which was considered appropriate punishment for failure to demonstrate adequate Christmas spirit. So while medieval Christmas gifts were modest by modern standards, the emphasis on games, competition, and community entertainment made the holiday season rich in experiences that brought people together through shared activities that were both meaningful and memorable. The spirit of play and mischief was considered just as important as religious devotion, and often received considerably more attention from participants who were looking for ways to make the darkest time of year more bearable through laughter, competition, and creative violence. Medieval Christmas religious observances, triple mass, and theological endurance tests. Amidst all the drunken wassailing, roasted boar consumption, and groups of grown men wearing goat costumes while declaring themselves temporary kings, there remained the small matter of celebrating the birth of Jesus Christ, which was technically the entire reason for the Christmas season in the first place. Medieval Christmas was simultaneously a holy day and a holiday, and few traditions captured the sacred aspect of the celebration more effectively than the solemn majesty of midnight mass on Christmas Eve. At the precise stroke of midnight on December 25th, villagers, nobles, merchants, and monks would bundle themselves in whatever warm clothing they possessed and trudge through cold winter air, often through snow and thick mud, to attend candlelit religious services that marked the official beginning of Christmas Day. Church bells would ring out across frozen landscapes, echoing over thatched rooftops and frost-covered fields, calling the faithful to gather for the most important religious observance of their entire year. The church building itself would be transformed for this special occasion, filled with aromatic incense that created mysterious clouds in the cold air, dozens of flickering candles that provided both light and spiritual symbolism, and evergreen branches that had been woven into elaborate garlands representing eternal life and God's unchanging love. If the congregation was fortunate, a trained choir might perform Gregorian chants in Latin that most people couldn't understand, but found deeply moving nonetheless. If they were less fortunate, the choir boys might be suffering from hangovers after sneaking ale from the wassail bowls, which would result in considerably less ethereal musical accompaniment. Medieval Christmas featured not one, but 3 separate masses throughout December 25th, each with its own theological significance and symbolic meaning. Yes, medieval Christians were expected to attend 3 different religious services on Christmas Day, which represented a significant commitment of time and energy, especially for people who had been celebrating enthusiastically for several days and might not be feeling entirely fresh for multiple church services. The first Mass at midnight symbolized Christ's eternal birth from God the Father, representing the divine nature of Jesus that existed before time began. The second Mass at dawn celebrated his physical birth from the Virgin Mary, acknowledging the human incarnation that made salvation possible for mankind. The third Mass during broad daylight represented Christ's spiritual birth in the hearts of believers, symbolizing the personal relationship between individual Christians and their Savior. This meant triple the religious symbolism, triple the theological complexity, and triple the amount of time spent sitting on cold stone benches while priests delivered sermons in Latin that might or might not be comprehensible to congregations who were more familiar with local dialects than ecclesiastical language. These religious services were definitely not brief affairs designed to accommodate people with limited attention spans or competing social obligations. Medieval masses featured extensive Gregorian chanting, elaborate religious processions that moved throughout the church building, multiple readings from scripture that required translation for illiterate audiences, and lengthy sermons that attempted to explain complex theological concepts to people who spent most of their lives focused on agricultural work and basic survival. For the majority of medieval Europeans, who were completely illiterate and rarely encountered formal education of any kind, church services meant considerable periods of standing respectfully, nodding solemnly at appropriate moments, and trying to figure out which saint they were supposed to be focusing their prayers toward at any given time. The experience was meant to be spiritually uplifting rather than intellectually accessible, creating an atmosphere of mystery and reverence that transported participants beyond their ordinary daily concerns. Churches often enhanced the Christmas experience by staging elaborate nativity plays, complete with local residents portraying Mary, Joseph, angels, shepherds, and various other biblical characters who were involved in the Christmas story. Sometimes these productions featured actual human infants who had been volunteered by their parents for the role of baby Jesus. Other times, the Christ child was represented by a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, depending on the availability of cooperative babies and their willingness to remain quiet during religious performances. These nativity plays were intended to be deeply reverent presentations of sacred events, but they often ended up providing unintentional comic relief when someone forgot their lines, a sheep escaped from the makeshift stable, or baby Jesus decided to express their opinions about being handled by strangers through loud crying that could be heard throughout the church building. In a world where daily life was unpredictable, frequently brutal and disappointingly short for most people, Christmas Mass offered something genuinely transcendent, a moment of peace, spiritual awe, and connection to divine light during the darkest and most challenging part of the year. The religious services provided an anchor of meaning that held all the secular chaos together, creating a foundation of sacred purpose that justified and sanctified the revelry that surrounded it. Medieval people understood that Christmas celebrations needed both elements to be complete: the solemn recognition of God's love demonstrated through Christ's birth, and the joyful human response that expressed gratitude through feasting, music, and community celebration. The sacred and the secular weren't considered contradictory forces. They were complementary aspects of a single response to the miracle of divine incarnation. And after 3 masses, multiple hours of Latin chanting, and extensive theological instruction about the mysteries of incarnation, most medieval Christians were probably ready for that final round of mulled wine and whatever remained of the roasted goose. Epiphany, the grand finale of medieval Christmas madness. After 12 consecutive days of feasting, singing, drinking, competitive games, and institutionalized absurdity that would have exhausted modern party planners, the medieval Christmas season concluded with one final spectacular explosion of celebration, the Feast of the Epiphany, observed on January 6th. This feast commemorated the arrival of the 3 wise men, also known as the Magi, who traveled from distant lands bearing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh for the newborn Christ child. For medieval Europeans, Epiphany was nearly as significant as Christmas Day itself, and it marked the moment when celebrants had to stop pretending that eating roasted swan while wearing ridiculous costumes and watching amateur theatrical performances was normal, socially acceptable behavior that could continue indefinitely. Epiphany celebrations featured all the religious pageantry that church authorities could organize: elaborate processions with expensive banners and religious relics, extensive incense burning that filled churches with aromatic clouds, lengthy chanting in Latin that most people couldn't understand but found spiritually moving, and symbolic offerings that represented the gifts brought by the wise men to honor the Christ child. In many regions, priests would bless water and homes with holy chalk, creating protective symbols that were supposed to guard against evil spirits, bad weather, natural disasters, and various other misfortunes that might threaten the household during the coming year. These blessing ceremonies provided spiritual insurance that gave people confidence about facing whatever challenges the new year might bring. But the religious observances were only part of the Epiphany celebration. The secular festivities were even more elaborate and chaotic than anything that had occurred during the previous 11 days, which was quite an achievement considering the level of organized mayhem that had already taken place. Many communities celebrated Epiphany with Twelfth Night festivals that represented the absolute peak of medieval holiday madness. These events featured music that could be heard for miles, elaborate masquerade costumes that transformed ordinary people into fantastic creatures, and sometimes full theatrical productions that combined religious themes with folk traditions in ways that created entertainment suitable for audiences who had been drinking continuously for nearly 2 weeks. One of the most popular Twelfth Night traditions involved crowning a king and queen of the bean, who were selected through a combination of luck and divine providence. Special cakes were prepared with dried beans, peas, or small tokens hidden inside the dough, and whoever discovered these objects in their portion became temporary royalty for the evening. The lucky winners got to wear paper crowns, issue ridiculous commands that everyone else was expected to obey, and generally boss people around while receiving the kind of deference that was normally reserved for actual nobility. This tradition was partly satirical social commentary and partly an excuse for final chaos before returning to normal social hierarchies and everyday responsibilities. The temporary monarchs could order people to sing embarrassing songs, perform silly dances, recite improvised poetry, or engage in other activities that would have been considered undignified under normal circumstances. Everyone was expected to participate enthusiastically and follow the commands of their bean-chosen rulers, creating an atmosphere of sanctioned anarchy that served as the perfect conclusion to the Christmas season. The food served during Epiphany celebrations was just as grand as anything that had been consumed during the previous days. Roasted meats, elaborate pies, rich stews, and especially the 12th cake, which was the direct ancestor of modern king cakes, filled tables throughout Europe. These cakes were usually packed with dried fruits, expensive spices, sugar when it was available, and various surprises that might include anything from coins to small religious tokens to items that were best left undiscovered until after consumption. At this point in the celebration, everyone was thoroughly bloated from nearly 2 weeks of constant feasting, possibly suffering from alcohol-related health issues, and vaguely aware that the approach of Lent would eventually ruin all their fun with weeks of required fasting and penitence. The contrast between Christmas abundance and Lenten austerity was intentional and meaningful, creating a cycle of indulgence and restraint that provided structure to the medieval religious year. For children, Epiphany was sometimes the primary gift-giving day of the Christmas season, reflecting the tradition of the Magi bringing presents to honor the infant Jesus. While medieval gifts were modest compared to modern standards, children looked forward to receiving nuts, fruits, small wooden toys, or occasionally coins that could be saved for future needs. Adults used Epiphany as the final socially acceptable opportunity to engage in activities that would be considered inappropriate during the rest of the year. Flirting with people who weren't their spouses, wearing devil masks to church services, cross-dressing for theatrical performances, or publicly mocking authority figures through satirical songs and performances. When the Epiphany festivities finally concluded, the decorations were carefully taken down and stored for the following year. The Yule log was allowed to burn out naturally, and its ashes were collected and saved for their protective and agricultural properties. People began the slow process of returning to their normal lives, which involved considerably more work, less food, fewer entertainment options, and significantly less tolerance for public drunkenness or theatrical behavior. The medieval Christmas season officially ended with Epiphany, but its effects lingered in community memories throughout the year. The 12 days had provided a crucial break from the grinding routine of medieval survival, offering spiritual renewal, social bonding, and psychological relief that helped people endure the challenges of daily life in a world where existence was precarious and often brutal. The transition from Christmas celebration back to ordinary life was both necessary and melancholy. The magical suspension of normal rules had to end eventually, but the experience of community joy, religious devotion, and sanctioned chaos had recharged people's spirits and strengthened social bonds that would sustain them through whatever difficulties lay ahead. Medieval Christmas was over for another year, leaving behind memories of inverted social orders, sacred reverence, drunken misrule, and communal celebration that had transformed the darkest time of year into a season of light, hope, and human connection that would be remembered and anticipated until the cycle began again the following December. Saturnalia, the Roman festival that invented Christmas chaos. Before Christmas celebrations existed, before Yule logs were dragged into medieval halls, and centuries before anyone had conceived of gingerbread houses or holiday shopping stress, ancient Romans had already perfected the art of winter festival mayhem with Saturnalia, a celebration so spectacularly wild and subversive that it makes modern office holiday parties look like silent prayer meetings conducted by particularly well-behaved monks. Saturnalia was dedicated to Saturn, the Roman god of agriculture, time, and liberation, and it began officially on December 17th, before exploding into a week-long celebration that temporarily suspended every social convention that normally held Roman civilization together. If you thought Romans were always serious, disciplined people who spent their time building roads and conquering territories while wearing pristine white togas, Saturnalia would have completely shattered your assumptions about their character and social priorities. The festival was fundamentally built around the revolutionary concept of role reversal, which meant that all the rigid social hierarchies that normally defined Roman society were temporarily flipped upside down and turned into sources of entertainment rather than systems of control. Masters served elaborate meals to their slaves, while the slaves lounged comfortably on expensive couches and issued commands with gleeful authority. Senators abandoned their dignified white togas in favor of colorful party clothes and wore ridiculous hats that would have scandalized their colleagues during normal political sessions. Women participated enthusiastically in activities that were usually reserved exclusively for men, including gambling, public speaking, and making decisions about household management without requiring male approval. The entire rigid Roman social structure was temporarily transformed into an elaborate costume party where everyone was encouraged to behave like completely different people for nearly a week. Saturnalia festivities officially began with religious ceremonies at Saturn's temple on the Capitoline Hill, where priests performed traditional sacrifices and conducted the most important ritual of the entire celebration, unbinding Saturn's statue from the woolen cords that restrained it throughout the rest of the year. This symbolic act represented the divine liberation of cosmic and social order, essentially providing official permission from the gods themselves for all the chaos that would follow. Once Saturn had been symbolically freed from his constraints, Roman society collectively decided to abandon most of their normal behavioral standards and embrace licensed misbehavior with enthusiasm that would have impressed professional entertainers. Shops and schools closed their doors for the duration of the festival. Public business ground to a complete halt as government officials decided they had more important things to do than manage the empire. Courts refused to hear legal cases because judges were too busy participating in dice games and drinking competitions. Even the Roman Senate, normally the most serious and dignified political institution in the known world, found more excuses than usual to avoid conducting official business because senators were busy wearing silly costumes and learning what it felt like to have their slaves give them orders about household management. For once in Roman history, the imperial machine paused its relentless expansion and administration so everyone could take a deep breath, put on party clothes, and dive headfirst into state-sanctioned debauchery that involved dice games, cross-dressing, and competitive alcohol consumption that would have concerned modern health professionals. The Romans absolutely loved the role reversal aspect of Saturnalia because it provided a rare opportunity to experience life from completely different social perspectives. The temporary inversion wasn't just tolerated by Roman authorities, it was ritualized chaos that was sanctioned by religious tradition and considered necessary for maintaining social stability throughout the rest of the year. Homes and public buildings were decorated with garlands, wreaths, and evergreen branches that symbolized life persisting through winter's harshness, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously festive and meaningful. Streets filled with laughter, music, and the constant clatter of dice rolling on marble surfaces as Romans engaged in gambling activities that were normally restricted or forbidden entirely. The gift-giving tradition during Saturnalia involved small, often humorous presents called sigillaria that were designed to amuse rather than impress recipients. These gifts typically included wax figurines, joke items, gag presents, nuts, dates, pastries, and various trinkets that were more about symbolism and sentiment than monetary value. Some gifts were intended to flatter the recipient, others were clearly designed to mock them, and many were obviously last-minute purchases from street vendors who specialized in providing emergency Saturnalia presents for people who had forgotten about gift-giving obligations until the last possible moment. Phallic charms were particularly popular Saturnalia gifts because Romans believed they brought fertility, protection from evil spirits, and general good luck to the recipient. These weren't considered inappropriate or scandalous presents. They were practical magical items that served important spiritual functions while also providing considerable entertainment value during gift exchange ceremonies. Romans also loved giving candles as Saturnalia gifts, partly because they were useful during the dark winter months and partly because they symbolized light returning after the winter solstice, representing hope and renewal during the most challenging time of year. Think of them as ancient versions of seasonal affective disorder treatment lamps, except with religious significance and considerably more fire hazards. The clothing worn during Saturnalia represented a complete abandonment of normal Roman dress codes and social conventions. Instead of formal white togas that indicated social status and political authority, people wore synthesis, which were colorful, informal robes that were usually reserved for private dining at home. Paired with the pileus, a soft, cone-shaped cap that symbolized freedom and liberation, these outfits were essentially the ancient equivalent of wearing holiday pajamas with Santa hats to formal social events. Saturnalia decorations would have seemed familiar to modern Christmas celebrants, since Romans used many of the same elements that we associate with contemporary holiday decorating. Evergreen branches symbolized eternal life and resilience during winter's darkness. Ivy and holly made frequent appearances in Roman holiday decorations, often combined with garlands and wreaths that created festive atmospheres in homes and public spaces. However, while everything looked appropriately celebratory, there was always an undercurrent of mischief and gentle mockery that pervaded Saturnalia activities. Romans took this opportunity to satirize their gods, mock the Senate's political decisions, and make fun of each other with the kind of irreverent humor that would have been dangerous during normal times, but was not only tolerated, but encouraged during the festival period. Sacred symbols were routinely parodied during Saturnalia, and religious processions often featured people dressed as Jupiter, Bacchus, or other deities, while behaving like drunken fools rather than dignified divine representations. One particularly memorable Saturnalia celebration even included a mock triumph parade featuring a donkey wearing a laurel crown, because apparently nothing said religious reverence quite like a decorated farm animal leading a procession of intoxicated Romans through city streets. The king of Saturnalia, temporary monarchy, and organized chaos. At the heart of every Saturnalia celebration was a single figure who embodied the spirit of sanctioned anarchy. The king of Saturnalia, sometimes called the Lord of Misrule, who served as a temporary monarch with absolute power to command ridiculous behavior and comprehensive authority to make everyone else extremely uncomfortable through creative humiliation. This temporary ruler was often chosen from among slaves or the lowest social classes, which represented the ultimate expression of Saturnalia's role reversal philosophy. By putting the most powerless person in complete charge of the celebration, Romans symbolically overturned their entire social hierarchy and created a topsy-turvy kingdom where normal rules of dignity, respect, and social deference simply didn't apply for nearly a week. Once crowned with a wreath made of vines or ivy, the king of Saturnalia could issue absolutely any command he could imagine, and everyone else was expected to obey without question or face public mockery that could last for months. These royal edicts might include ordering senators to sing love songs to pieces of fruit, commanding citizens to dance like farm animals for extended periods, or requiring nobles to recite classical poetry while hiccuping continuously. The absurdity was entirely intentional and carefully planned to be as ridiculous as possible. The goal wasn't just entertainment, though the comedy value was considerable. The king of Saturnalia was meant to embody Saturn himself, representing freedom, fertility, and divine disorder that challenged human attempts to control natural forces through rigid social structures. The selection process for the king of Saturnalia often involved hiding a bean, coin, or small token inside a special cake, and whoever discovered the object in their portion automatically became temporary royalty for the duration of the festival. This tradition would later echo through European celebrations as the king cake custom during Epiphany and other winter festivals, demonstrating how Roman practices influenced medieval Christmas traditions centuries after the empire's fall. However, the Romans weren't thinking about future Christian holidays when they chose their Saturnalia kings. They were focused on identifying whoever looked funniest wearing a makeshift crown made of garden vegetation, while commanding respected citizens to engage in activities that would normally result in social ostracism or political exile. In earlier centuries, the role of mock king may have carried darker implications that were connected to ancient fertility rituals, where the temporary monarch might actually be sacrificed at the end of his reign. These older traditions possibly involved real human sacrifice as a way of ensuring agricultural prosperity and divine favor for the coming year. Fortunately, by the imperial period, the worst fate awaiting a king of Saturnalia was a severe hangover and a collection of deeply embarrassing stories that would be repeated at social gatherings for years to come. The temporary nature of the king's authority was essential to the tradition's meaning and social function. When Saturnalia ended, the mock monarch removed his vine crown, returned to his normal social position, and the regular hierarchy resumed operation as if nothing unusual had happened. Slaves went back to serving their masters, senators resumed wearing dignified white togas, and the absurdity faded into memory like a shared dream that everyone had experienced together. But for those brief days, a person who was normally powerless could command a senator to perform embarrassing dances, and all of Rome would cheer enthusiastically for the spectacle. The temporary inversion of power relations served as both entertainment and social pressure valve, allowing people to experience different perspectives while reinforcing the normal order through contrast and temporary absence. The King of Saturnalia tradition demonstrated Rome's sophisticated understanding of social psychology and political management. By providing sanctioned opportunities for rebellion and role reversal, the authorities actually strengthened their normal control systems while giving people harmless outlets for frustrations that might otherwise develop into serious political problems. Roman gift-giving and holiday fashion, sigillaria and synthesis. Saturnalia gift-giving operated on completely different principles from modern Christmas shopping, which would have baffled Romans who were accustomed to presents that were small, personal, inexpensive, and often completely ridiculous. If you think receiving socks for Christmas represents disappointing gift selection, try receiving a wax figurine shaped like a turnip or a small clay replica of household furniture that serves no practical purpose whatsoever. The Roman approach to holiday presents was based on symbolism, sentiment, and humor, rather than monetary value or practical utility. Saturnalia gifts were called sigillaria, and they typically consisted of small wax or clay figurines, joke items designed to amuse the recipient, trinkets that held personal meaning, or edible treats like nuts, dates, and pastries that could be consumed during the celebration. Some sigillaria were meant to flatter the recipient by depicting them in heroic poses or comparing them to gods and mythological figures. Others were clearly designed to mock personal characteristics, embarrassing habits, or social pretensions through satirical representations that everyone would recognize and find amusing. Many gifts were obviously last-minute purchases from market stalls, chosen more for convenience than thoughtfulness, but the gesture itself was considered more important than the specific item exchanged. Phallic charms were extremely popular Saturnalia gifts, not because Romans were obsessed with sexual imagery, but because these symbols were believed to provide fertility, protection from evil forces, and general good luck to anyone who possessed them. These charms weren't considered inappropriate or scandalous by Roman standards. They were practical magical items that served important spiritual functions while also generating considerable laughter during gift exchange ceremonies. Modern people might find phallic gift-giving awkward, but Romans viewed these charms as essential protective devices that were both meaningful and entertaining, making them perfect Saturnalia, presents that combined practical magic with festive humor. Romans also frequently gave candles as holiday gifts, partly because they provided useful illumination during the dark winter months, and partly because they carried deep symbolic meaning. Candles represented light returning after the winter solstice, hope persisting through difficult times, and divine illumination that could guide people through spiritual and practical challenges. These weren't just practical gifts, they were ancient versions of inspirational messages that provided both functional benefits and emotional support. Handwritten verses and witty jokes were also common Saturnalia presents, making this possibly the only time in history when being a sarcastic poet actually generated income and social appreciation. Romans loved clever wordplay, satirical observations, and humorous commentary on politics and social conventions, so original verses that made people laugh were considered valuable gifts that demonstrated both intelligence and friendship. Children particularly loved Saturnalia because it was one of the rare times when they were not only indulged with special treats and small toys, but also allowed to participate fully in adult festivities. Young Romans could gamble with their elders, make jokes about authority figures, and even boss around adult servants as part of the role reversal activities that defined the celebration. For Roman children, Saturnalia was essentially winning the cultural lottery, since they gained temporary access to adult privileges while also receiving gifts and special foods that weren't available during the rest of the year. The gift-giving usually occurred on or around December 19th during the height of Saturnalia celebrations, and much like modern holiday shopping, it came with social pressure, elevated expectations, and occasional passive-aggressive responses from recipients who felt their presents weren't sufficiently thoughtful or expensive. However, because Roman gifts were expected to be modest rather than lavish, the social pressure was considerably less intense than contemporary Christmas shopping, and people could participate meaningfully in the tradition without bankrupting themselves or spending weeks searching for perfect presents that would adequately express their feelings. Roman holiday fashion during Saturnalia represented a complete rejection of normal dress codes and social conventions that governed appearance during the rest of the year. Instead of formal togas that indicated social rank and political authority, Romans wore synthesis, which were colorful, informal robes that were usually reserved for private dining at home. These garments were the ancient equivalent of wearing bathrobes to formal social events, and everyone was not only allowed but encouraged to abandon dignified appearance in favor of comfort, color, and casual celebration. The syntheses were often brightly colored, made from expensive fabrics when possible, and designed to be comfortable for extended periods of eating, drinking, and reclining on couches during elaborate feast celebrations, paired with the pileus, a soft, cone-shaped cap that symbolized freedom and liberation from social constraints. The complete Saturnalia outfit announced that the wearer was temporarily exempt from normal behavioral expectations and ready to participate in whatever chaos the festival might offer. The visual effect of hundreds of Romans wearing colorful party clothes instead of dignified white togas would have been striking and slightly surreal, like attending a formal government meeting where everyone had decided to wear pajamas and party hats instead of business suits. Even the decorations during Saturnalia combined beauty with mischief in ways that created festive environments, while also providing opportunities for satirical commentary and gentle mockery. Homes, temples, and public buildings were covered with garlands made from evergreen branches, colorful ribbons, and seasonal flowers that created attractive displays while also serving as backdrops for activities that would have been scandalous during normal times. The combination of beautiful decorations with subversive activities created a unique atmosphere that was simultaneously elegant and chaotic, reverent and irreverent, traditional and revolutionary. Saturnalia demonstrated Rome's ability to maintain sophisticated cultural standards while also providing sanctioned outlets for behavior that challenged those same standards through temporary suspension of normal rules. Saturnalia's sacred roots and spiritual significance. While Saturnalia celebrations appeared to be nothing more than elaborate excuses for public intoxication, dice-based entertainment, and toga-related karaoke performances, the festival actually had deep sacred roots and serious spiritual significance that connected Roman religious practices to ancient agricultural traditions and mythological beliefs about divine justice and cosmic order. Saturnalia wasn't invented by Romans as a convenient excuse for winter partying. The celebration evolved from ancient religious traditions that honored Saturn as one of Rome's oldest and most complex deities, representing far more than simple agricultural prosperity. Saturn embodied the memory of a mythical golden age when humanity supposedly lived in perfect peace, complete equality, and natural abundance without requiring kings, slaves, wars, or complex social hierarchies to maintain order. According to Roman mythology, Saturn had once ruled during an ideal period of human history when the earth produced food without requiring agricultural labor, when people shared resources freely without concepts of private property, when social conflicts didn't exist because everyone lived in harmony with natural law and divine will. This golden age represented everything that contemporary Roman society had lost through civilization, conquest, and the development of complex political institutions. By the time Romans built Saturn's temple in the Forum in 497 BCE, the Golden Age was obviously long gone, replaced by an empire that was built on military conquest, slave labor, rigid social hierarchies, and constant political maneuvering. However, people still remembered the mythological ideal and longed to experience, even briefly, what life might have been like when Saturn ruled with divine wisdom and justice. Saturnalia served as a ritual reenactment of that perfect past, providing an annual opportunity to temporarily recreate the conditions of the Golden Age through role reversal, wealth sharing, and the suspension of social hierarchies that normally defined Roman civilization. For 1 week each year, Romans attempted to bring back Saturn's reign by eliminating the distinctions between masters and slaves, rich and poor, powerful and powerless. The festival always began with formal religious ceremonies at Saturn's temple, followed by public banquets that were open to people of all social classes, regardless of their economic status or political connections. These weren't casual community meals. They were sacred feasts that symbolized the abundance and equality that had characterized Saturn's mythical reign. Priests would unveil Saturn's statue during the opening ceremonies, unbinding the woolen ropes that normally restrained the god throughout the year. This ritual act represented the liberation of divine forces that had been suppressed by human attempts to control natural processes through social institutions and political structures. When Saturn was freed from his bonds, cosmic order was temporarily suspended, and the natural state of divine equality could briefly reassert itself. Even the specific timing of Saturnalia carried spiritual significance beyond simple seasonal celebration. The festival occurred during the winter solstice period, marking the darkest time of the year when the sun appeared to be weakening and dying. Saturnalia welcomed the sun's return with light, fire, evergreen decorations, and joyful celebration that affirmed life's triumph over death and renewal's victory over decay. The candles that Romans gave each other weren't merely practical gifts for winter illumination, they were symbols of hope, spiritual enlightenment, and divine light that could guide humanity through periods of darkness, both literal and metaphorical. The evergreen decorations represented life that persisted despite winter's challenges, demonstrating nature's resilience and God's continuing care for creation. Saturnalia provided more than entertainment and social pressure relief, though those functions were certainly important. The festival offered Romans a glimpse, however fleeting and chaotic, of the world as it once was, according to their religious traditions, or as it might someday become again if humanity could learn to live according to divine principles rather than human ambitions. The sacred meaning of Saturnalia helped justify and sanctify behavior that would otherwise have been considered socially destructive or politically dangerous. Because the role reversals and social inversions were performed in honor of Saturn and in memory of the Golden Age, they became religious acts rather than simple rebellion, spiritual exercises rather than mere entertainment. Romans understood that their civilization depended on maintaining social order political authority, and economic hierarchies that enabled the empire to function effectively. However, they also recognized that these human institutions could become oppressive and unjust if they weren't occasionally challenged and renewed through contact with divine ideals and mythological alternatives. Saturnalia provided that renewal by offering controlled access to a different way of organizing society, even if that access was temporary and ritualized rather than permanent and revolutionary. The festival reminded Romans of their spiritual values while allowing them to experience alternatives to their normal social arrangements without threatening the stability of their political system. Saturnalia's influence on Christian Christmas traditions. When early Christian communities began establishing their own winter celebrations, they encountered a significant practical problem. Saturnalia was extraordinarily popular with Roman citizens who had been enjoying this festival for centuries and weren't particularly interested in abandoning their favorite holiday just because a new religion was becoming politically influential throughout the empire. Christian leaders could certainly preach about the importance of humility, spiritual rebirth, and focusing on religious rather than secular concerns during the winter season. However, when your neighbors across the street were wearing ivy crowns, engaging in organized gambling, and distributing free wine while laughing loudly enough to be heard from several blocks away, your congregation might begin wondering whether Christianity was really offering them a better deal during the darkest time of year. Rather than competing directly with Saturnalia's established popularity, early Christian authorities made the pragmatic decision to borrow liberally from Roman traditions while gradually redirecting their focus toward Christian themes and biblical stories. This wasn't necessarily conscious plagiarism, but it represented practical adaptation to cultural realities that couldn't be easily changed through religious instruction alone. The timing of Christmas, officially established on December 25th, conveniently overlapped with the Roman festival of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, while also following immediately after Saturnalia's conclusion on December 23rd. Whether this scheduling was coincidental or strategic remains debatable, but the alignment certainly made it easier for Roman converts to Christianity to transition from familiar pagan celebrations to new Christian observances without experiencing significant cultural disruption. Along with the convenient timing came numerous specific traditions that migrated almost directly from Saturnalia into Christian Christmas celebrations. Gift-giving during the Christmas season clearly echoed the Roman practice of exchanging sigillaria, though Christian authorities gradually shifted the focus from humor and satire toward expressions of love, charity, and spiritual devotion. The tradition of decorating homes and churches with evergreen branches, candles, and garlands had been central to Saturnalia celebrations for centuries before Christians adopted these same elements for Christmas decorations. The symbolic meanings were easily adapted from pagan concepts about life persisting through winter to Christian themes about eternal life through Jesus Christ and divine light overcoming spiritual darkness. The practice of wearing special holiday clothing and temporarily suspending normal social hierarchies also transferred from Roman celebrations into Christian Christmas traditions, though usually in more moderate forms that were acceptable to church authorities who were concerned about maintaining appropriate religious dignity during sacred seasons. Even the elaborate communal feasting that characterized medieval Christmas celebrations showed clear influences from Roman Saturnalia banquets, where social classes mingled freely and abundance was shared among community members regardless of their normal economic circumstances. Some early Christian leaders were absolutely furious about these obvious parallels between Christian and pagan celebrations. St. Augustine famously condemned Christian believers who treated Christ's birth like a pagan festival, warning against celebrating with drunkenness, excessive eating, dancing, and other activities that seemed more appropriate for honoring Roman gods than commemorating the Savior's nativity. However, Augustine's complaints indicate that Christians were already combining biblical themes with Roman celebration styles, creating hybrid observances that satisfied both religious requirements and cultural expectations. Most Christian communities simply ignored clerical objections and continued developing Christmas traditions that incorporated elements they found meaningful and enjoyable from their pagan heritage. By the medieval period, many Saturnalia customs had been seamlessly integrated into Christmas celebrations throughout Europe. The Lord of Misrule tradition in English Christmas was a direct descendant of the Saturnalia king, continuing the Roman practice of temporarily crowning a mock monarch who had authority to reverse social hierarchies and command ridiculous behavior from social superiors. The Twelfth Night revelries that concluded medieval Christmas seasons followed the same patterns of role reversal, masked entertainment, and sanctioned chaos that had characterized Roman winter festivals centuries earlier. Medieval Christians were essentially celebrating Saturnalia under Christian auspices, maintaining the substance of pagan traditions while adapting their surface meanings to fit biblical themes. Even the tradition of exchanging gifts on or around Christmas Day had deep roots in Roman Saturnalia practices, though Christian interpretations connected the custom to the gifts brought by the Magi to honor the infant Jesus, rather than the satirical sigillaria that Romans had exchanged to amuse each other during their winter festival. Today, many Christmas customs that seem essentially Christian actually preserve elements of ancient Roman Saturnalia that have survived for over 2,000 years through gradual adaptation and cultural transmission. The emphasis on generosity toward others, the temporary suspension of normal social rules during holiday celebrations, the focus on family and community gatherings, and the idea that winter's darkest time should be met with light, laughter, and hope all echo Saturnalia traditions that Romans had perfected centuries before Christianity became the dominant religion in Europe. Modern Christmas celebrations represent a remarkable synthesis of pagan and Christian elements that demonstrates how religious traditions can absorb and transform cultural practices rather than simply replacing them. The result is a holiday that satisfies both spiritual needs and cultural expectations while preserving ancient wisdom about the importance of community celebration during challenging times. In the medieval world, when the first labor pains began signaling that new life was about to enter the world, there was no modern hospital to rush to, no team of medical doctors standing ready with advanced equipment, and no emergency services that could be summoned with a simple phone call. Instead, a desperate messenger would be sent running through village streets or castle corridors to fetch the one person everyone hoped would be available: the midwife, a woman who literally carried the balance between life and death in her weathered, experienced hands, and who understood better than anyone that every single birth was essentially a battle against medieval mortality rates that claimed both mothers and infants with frightening regularity. The medieval midwife occupied a unique and precarious position in her community, simultaneously respected and feared, desperately needed and constantly suspected. She was often the only person in an entire village or region who possessed any practical experience with childbirth complications, making her simultaneously indispensable during medical emergencies and vulnerable to blame when things went tragically wrong despite her best efforts. Her training didn't come from universities which didn't admit women and rarely addressed obstetric medicine anyway, but from older midwives, female family members, and the kind of painful hands-on experience that could only be gained through years of dealing with difficult births, emergency situations, and the heartbreaking reality that not every delivery would end happily regardless of skill or dedication. A young woman might begin her midwifery education by helping her mother, aunt, or grandmother during births in their community, gradually learning to recognize the warning signs that distinguished normal labor from dangerous complications that required immediate intervention. She would slowly master the uses of various herbs that could ease pain, reduce bleeding, or stimulate contractions when labor stalled dangerously. More importantly, she would develop the psychological resilience necessary to remain calm and effective while other people panicked, to make life or death decisions quickly without the luxury of consulting medical textbooks or conferring with colleagues, and to accept responsibility for outcomes that were often determined by factors completely beyond human control. The medieval midwife's toolkit was humble but essential, representing centuries of accumulated practical wisdom that had been passed down through generations of women who understood that childbirth was both a natural process and a medical emergency that could turn deadly within minutes. She carried herbs like pennyroyal, mugwort, yarrow, and shepherd's purse that could be used for pain relief, bleeding control, or encouraging proper uterine contractions when labor wasn't progressing normally. Clean cloths soaked in vinegar or wine served as primitive antiseptic materials, not because medieval people understood bacterial infection, but because they had observed through experience that wine seemed to help prevent some complications, even if they couldn't explain the underlying medical reasons. Olive oil or almond oil was used to massage the mother's belly during labor and to help prevent tearing during delivery. A sharp knife or pair of shears was essential for cutting the umbilical cord once the baby was safely delivered. If an infant wasn't breathing at birth, the midwife might clear mucus from its nose and mouth manually or swing the baby gently to stimulate crying and proper respiratory function. Perhaps most controversially from a religious perspective, many midwives performed emergency baptisms when babies were born dying, and no priest was immediately available to provide the sacrament. Although this was technically reserved for ordained clergy, practical necessity often overruled canonical law when a soul's eternal salvation hung in the balance, and clerical authorities were hours or days away from the birthing chamber. Medieval birth was fundamentally a communal female experience that excluded men unless absolute catastrophe threatened the mother's life. Labor occurred in the woman's own home, surrounded by a carefully chosen circle of trusted women, relatives, neighbors, close friends, and sometimes the local wise woman or herbalist who could provide additional medical knowledge and emotional support during the long, dangerous process of bringing new life into the world. These women weren't simply passive observers waiting to see what would happen. They actively participated in the birth by holding the laboring mother in different positions, massaging her back and belly to ease pain and encourage proper positioning of the baby, bringing hot cloths and warm beverages, whispering encouragement during difficult moments, and singing traditional songs or lullabies that were believed to help both mother and unborn child. At the center of this female sanctuary stood the midwife, directing the other women with quiet authority that came from years of experience with similar situations. She wasn't always gentle in her approach, because medieval childbirth required practical decisiveness rather than modern bedside manner. Sometimes she had to shout over screams to be heard, slap a woman's face to bring her back from the edge of panic or unconsciousness, or bark urgent orders for more hot water, additional clean cloths, or immediate assistance with repositioning the mother. The midwife watched constantly for warning signs that could indicate life-threatening complications, changes in the mother's breathing patterns, the way her belly contracted or relaxed, the expression in her eyes when pain shifted from normal labor discomfort to something more dangerous that required immediate intervention. She learned to listen for significant silences that might mean the baby was in distress or the mother was beginning to hemorrhage internally. When everything progressed normally, the child would be born healthy and crying, the mother's tears of pain would transform into laughter of relief and joy, and the entire birthing chamber would fill with celebration, gratitude, and the kind of profound emotional release that comes from witnessing new life successfully entering the world despite all the dangers that threatened to prevent it. However, medieval midwives also had to be prepared for situations that required quick emergency action. A hemorrhage meant immediately stuffing the uterus with clean rags or even using her own hand to apply direct pressure to bleeding vessels. A baby that wasn't breathing required attempts at resuscitation through rubbing, warming, gentle manipulation, or even breathing directly into the infant's mouth, techniques that were based on practical observation rather than medical theory, but sometimes proved effective anyway. Stillbirths and maternal deaths were tragically common occurrences that every experienced midwife had to face multiple times during her career. When death claimed either mother or child, the midwife couldn't allow herself the luxury of grief or shock. She had to clean and prepare the bodies, wrap the deceased infant appropriately, offer comfort to surviving family members, and say whatever prayers she knew while maintaining enough emotional control to handle the practical necessities that death always required. If a baby was dying and hadn't yet been baptized, many midwives would perform emergency baptism themselves, using wine, holy water if it was available, or even their own saliva if necessary. This practice was technically forbidden by church authorities who reserved sacramental duties for ordained priests, but it was widely practiced anyway by women who believed that saving souls was more important than following ecclesiastical regulations during medical emergencies. Medieval midwives weren't miracle workers who could overcome the fundamental limitations of their era's medical knowledge and available treatments. However, they fought like dedicated warriors against pain, massive blood loss, infection, and the constant shadow of death that hovered just outside every cottage door where women labored to bring new life into an often hostile world. Sometimes they won these battles through skill, experience, and sheer determination to keep fighting until the very last moment. That possibility of victory, however slim it might be in difficult cases, was usually enough motivation to keep trying, keep learning, and keep showing up whenever desperate families needed someone who understood that birth and death were often separated by nothing more than knowledge, timing, and the steady hands of a woman who refused to give up when lives hung in the balance. The midwife as spiritual guardian and social outcast. In medieval Europe, the line between life and death was razor-thin and nowhere more visible than in the hands of midwives who didn't simply deliver babies, but sometimes baptized them as well, and occasionally served as the final witnesses to lives that ended before they had truly begun. This spiritual responsibility put midwives in extremely delicate positions where they served simultaneously as healers, religious functionaries, and potential scapegoats when grief-stricken families needed someone to blame for tragedies that were often beyond human control. The Catholic Church taught that unbaptized babies couldn't enter heaven after death, but were instead condemned to limbo, a spiritual realm where they weren't punished for sins they had never committed, but were forever cut off from the divine light and eternal happiness that awaited properly baptized Christians. In rural communities where priests might be located several miles away from birthing chambers, or simply unreachable during long winter nights when roads were impassable, the midwife often became the only person present who could perform the sacred ritual that would save a dying infant soul from eternal separation from God. When a baby emerged blue, unresponsive, or clearly dying despite the midwife's best medical efforts, she would sprinkle whatever liquid was available, usually wine, blessed water, or even her own saliva, onto the child's forehead while murmuring the essential words, "I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost." Technically, this sacramental act was supposed to be performed only by ordained priests who had received proper theological training and ecclesiastical authority, but practical necessity often overruled canonical regulations when eternal souls were at stake and clerical authorities were unavailable. Most people, including many local priests, quietly looked the other way when midwives performed emergency baptisms, understanding that saving souls was more important than maintaining strict adherence to church bureaucracy during medical crises. It was generally considered better to bend religious rules slightly than to allow innocent children to suffer eternal consequences because of administrative technicalities or geographic inconvenience. However, this spiritual authority came with serious risks that could destroy a midwife's reputation and livelihood if circumstances turned against her. If a baby died despite being baptized by the midwife, and especially if the mother also died during or after childbirth, suspicion often followed like a persistent shadow. Family members and neighbors might begin whispering questions. Did she use the wrong herbs? Did she delay the birth through incompetence or malice? Was she secretly practicing witchcraft or working with darker forces that had caused these deaths rather than prevented them? The line between folk medicine and witchcraft was often impossibly blurry in medieval thinking, and midwives who used herbal remedies spoke incantations or prayers that weren't always officially sanctioned by church authorities, and employed protective charms or rituals that combined Christian and pagan elements were particularly vulnerable to accusations when their patients didn't survive. A midwife who had successfully saved dozens of lives over many years of practice could suddenly find herself transformed into a suspect by a single tragic outcome that had nothing to do with her skills or intentions. The same knowledge of herbs and healing techniques that made her invaluable during medical emergencies could be reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural manipulation if people needed someone to blame for deaths that seemed inexplicable or particularly cruel. Medieval people understood that childbirth was dangerous, but they also believed that premature deaths might be caused by divine punishment for sins, demonic interference with natural processes, or malicious magic practiced by people who appeared to be healers but were actually working for evil purposes. When grief and fear combined with limited understanding of medical causes, even the most dedicated midwife could find herself accused of causing the very deaths she had tried desperately to prevent. If a midwife failed to perform emergency baptism, or if the baptism didn't seem to take because the baby died anyway, the spiritual consequences for the infant added another layer of blame and resentment. Families who believed their children were condemned to limbo because of the midwife's negligence or incompetence might seek revenge through social ostracism, economic boycotts, or even formal accusations of heresy or witchcraft that could result in imprisonment, trial, or execution. And yet, despite all these risks and the constant possibility that her next patient might become her last if something went wrong, the medieval midwife continued practicing her dangerous profession. She kept showing up at birthing chambers throughout her community because someone had to be there when women needed help, and because while everyone else panicked about theology and supernatural explanations, she remained focused on what really mattered: the sound of a living child's first cry, the steady rhythm of a mother's breathing, and the simple, sacred relief that came from successfully guiding another soul safely into the world. The midwife understood better than most people that life and death were often determined by factors completely beyond human control, but she also knew that knowledge, experience, and steady determination could sometimes make the crucial difference between tragedy and triumph. That possibility was worth the risks, even when those risks included not just professional failure, but potential accusations of supernatural evil and eternal damnation. Women's sacred space, the medieval birthing chamber. The medieval birthing chamber represented one of the few spaces in European society where women held complete authority, and men were not merely unwelcome, but actively forbidden unless circumstances became so dire that medical catastrophe threatened to claim both mother and child. Here, in the tight, smoky, sometimes chaotic confines of a peasant's cottage, or the more luxurious but equally tense atmosphere of a noblewoman's private apartment, the midwife presided over a world built by women for women, held together by shared experience of pain, prayer, and the fierce protective love that connected mothers across all social boundaries. This exclusively female environment wasn't simply a matter of social convention or personal preference. Medieval people genuinely believed that childbirth was fundamentally a women's mystery that required female wisdom, female strength, and female spiritual authority to navigate successfully. Men were considered not just useless during labor, but potentially dangerous to the process, because their presence might interfere with the natural flow of energy and divine assistance that women needed to bring new life safely into the world. The birthing circle that surrounded each laboring woman wasn't composed of random female relatives who happened to be available during medical emergencies. These were carefully chosen trusted companions, mothers, sisters, aunts, close friends, and experienced neighbors who had survived their own pregnancies and could offer both practical assistance and emotional support based on personal understanding of what the laboring woman was experiencing. These supporting women weren't passive observers waiting to see what would happen. They had specific roles and responsibilities that were essential to the birthing process: holding the mother upright when she needed support, massaging her back and belly to ease pain and encourage proper positioning of the baby, bringing hot cloths and warm herbal teas, singing traditional lullabies or birth songs that were believed to help both mother and infant, and providing continuous encouragement during the long, exhausting hours when labor seemed to progress too slowly or stall entirely. At the center of this female sanctuary stood the midwife, directing activities with quiet authority that commanded immediate obedience, even from women who might normally outrank her socially or economically. During childbirth, social hierarchies became irrelevant because medical knowledge and practical experience were the only qualifications that mattered when lives hung in the balance. The midwife wasn't always gentle or reassuring in her approach to patient care. Medieval childbirth required decisive action and clear communication rather than modern bedside manner or therapeutic emotional support. Sometimes she had to speak firmly or even harshly to maintain control over panicked family members, issue urgent commands for specific supplies or assistance, or physically restrain women who were attempting to move in ways that could endanger themselves or their babies. However, The midwife also understood the importance of providing spiritual and emotional comfort during what was often the most frightening experience of a woman's life. She might lead group prayers to the Virgin Mary or St. Margaret of Antioch, who was the patron saint of women in childbirth. She could stage protective rituals like binding a red ribbon around the mother's wrist to ward off evil spirits, lighting blessed candles to invoke divine assistance, or pouring wine onto the earth outside the dwelling to appease any supernatural forces that might be threatening the birth. When the baby finally arrived, wet, slippery, and ideally crying loudly enough to demonstrate healthy lung function, the celebration that erupted in the birthing chamber wasn't just relief that the immediate danger had passed. It was a spiritual and emotional explosion that represented triumph over death, successful completion of one of life's most important transitions, and the miraculous appearance of new life that would carry forward the family's lineage and hopes for the future. There would be laughter mixed with tears of joy, fervent prayers of gratitude, and often bread and ale passed around among the women who had shared this intense experience together. If the birth had been particularly difficult or dangerous, there might also be small gifts exchanged or promises made to patron saints in acknowledgement of divine intervention that had prevented tragedy. In a world that offered women very limited opportunities for exercising real authority or demonstrating competence outside their domestic roles, the birthing chamber provided a rare realm of female power, where women's knowledge, skills, and spiritual insights were not just respected, but desperately needed. The midwife served as guardian not only of individual mothers and babies, but of the bonds between women that had been woven through centuries of shared knowledge, whispered secrets, inherited wisdom, and fierce protective love that transcended social boundaries and economic differences. This sacred female space preserved and transmitted practical knowledge about women's bodies, herbal remedies, spiritual practices, and emotional support techniques that couldn't be learned from books because it wasn't written down anywhere. It was passed directly from woman to woman through hands-on experience, spoken instruction, and the kind of intimate understanding that could only be gained through personal participation in the fundamental mystery of bringing new life into existence, despite all the forces that opposed it. The economic and social reality of medieval midwifery. Being a medieval midwife wasn't a profession that attracted women seeking wealth, social prestige, or comfortable working conditions. It was grueling, often thankless labor that was frequently unpaid or compensated only with promises of future consideration, and yet it represented one of the few respectable ways for women to gain social status, develop professional expertise, and earn modest livelihoods in societies that offered them almost no other opportunities for meaningful work outside their domestic responsibilities. Most practicing midwives weren't members of the nobility who had chosen obstetrics as an interesting hobby between social engagements. They were typically peasant women, tradespeople's wives, or widows who had built their reputations over years of successful service to their communities and had gradually become known as reliable sources of medical assistance during birthing emergencies. In larger towns and cities, some midwives achieved sufficient local fame to be appointed as official parish midwives, with semi-formal recognition from church or civic authorities. However, in smaller rural villages, they were often treated more like skilled servants who were expected to appear whenever summoned, regardless of weather conditions, time of day, or their own personal circumstances and family obligations. Payment for midwifery services was inconsistent at best and completely absent at worst. Wealthy urban families might provide small amounts of actual money, gifts of wine or expensive cloth, or promises of future considerations that may or may not be honored, depending on the outcome of the birth and the family's subsequent financial situation. More commonly, compensation took the form of practical goods, a chicken at harvest time, bread from the next baking session, vegetables from the family garden, or small household items that the midwife could use herself or trade for other necessities. Poor rural families often couldn't afford any payment beyond expressions of gratitude and promises of reciprocal assistance that might never materialize due to their own economic struggles. If the mother or child died during or after birth, even promised compensation could vanish entirely, leaving the midwife not just unpaid for her efforts, but potentially blamed for the tragic outcome and excluded from future opportunities to serve the community. Despite these economic uncertainties and social risks, skilled midwives could gradually build a form of quiet social power that was rare for medieval women. They were respected, feared, and desperately needed by women from all social classes who understood that successful childbirth often depended more on the midwife's knowledge and experience than on their own social status or economic resources. Over time, if a midwife managed to avoid major scandals and maintain a record of successful births that outweighed her inevitable failures, she could become an integral part of her community's social fabric. She was the woman that other women whispered about with awe and gratitude, the one they called upon before their labor even began, the person they trusted more completely than any priest or physician when their lives and their children's lives hung in the balance. Some European cities during the later medieval period began to formalize midwifery practice through licensing systems administered by male physicians or church officials. This represented a dubious combination of medical oversight and moral policing that was designed more to control women's activities than to improve obstetric care. But it did provide some midwives with official recognition and legal protection that could be valuable when accusations or complaints arose. However, even formally licensed midwives were rarely compensated adequately for their services or treated as medical professionals equal to male physicians who had university training and church sanction. The social status was largely symbolic, while the actual risks remained very real and the financial rewards stayed modest at best. And yet, despite the physical exhaustion, irregular income, and constant threat of blame when births ended tragically, medieval midwives continued practicing their dangerous profession because they provided services that no one else could or would offer. They understood that their communities desperately needed their knowledge and skills, and they took pride in their ability to help women survive one of life's most dangerous passages while bringing new life safely into an often hostile world. The satisfaction of hearing a healthy baby's first cry, seeing a mother's face transform from pain to joy, and knowing that another family would remain intact because of her knowledge and dedication was often sufficient motivation to continue serving her community despite all the economic and social challenges that came with being a medieval midwife. For many women, midwifery represented not just a way to earn modest livelihoods, but a calling that allowed them to use their intelligence, compassion, and hard-won experience to make genuine differences in other people's lives at moments when that assistance was literally a matter of life and death. The gradual disappearance of the medieval midwife. The working life of a medieval midwife rarely concluded with public recognition, formal retirement ceremonies, or monuments erected in her honor. No statues were carved to commemorate her contributions to her community's welfare, and no books preserved detailed accounts of her knowledge and experiences for future generations to study and appreciate. Yet for hundreds of years, she remained the quiet, essential guardian of life itself, guiding countless generations into the world with weathered hands and hard-earned wisdom, disappearing from historical records just as quietly as she had lived and worked. Many midwives died in poverty and anonymity, having spent their lives serving others without accumulating personal wealth or achieving social recognition beyond their immediate communities. Their stories faded from memory unless they were preserved in parish records, court documents that mentioned them in connection with legal disputes, or the grateful recollections of families whose lives they had saved during medical emergencies. Some midwives were eventually buried with community gratitude and respect, their herbal knowledge and practical skills passed on to younger women who had served as their apprentices and assistants. Others were forgotten entirely, or worse, remembered primarily for accusations of wrongdoing that arose during their final years when age, illness, or changing social attitudes made them vulnerable to suspicion and blame. However, the impact of medieval midwives rippled silently through history in ways that could never be adequately measured or documented. Every woman who survived childbirth in a mud-floor cottage or cold stone castle chamber owed her life to one of these dedicated practitioners. Every healthy baby who was placed into swaddling clothes had first felt the experienced hands of a midwife who had already delivered dozens, perhaps hundreds, of infants during her career. Their accumulated knowledge persisted through oral tradition, even when it wasn't written down in medical texts or formal training manuals. The information about which herbs could ease labor pains, which prayers provided comfort during difficult births, which positions helped when delivery stalled dangerously, and which warning signs indicated medical emergencies continued to pass from mother to daughter, midwife to apprentice, and woman to woman across generations. Medieval midwives preserved and transmitted essential knowledge about women's bodies, childbirth processes, and infant care that kept maternal and infant mortality rates from being even higher than they already were in an era that lacked modern medical knowledge, surgical techniques, and pharmaceutical interventions that we now consider basic necessities for safe childbirth. The Church may have attempted to control midwives through oaths, regulations, and threats of excommunication. Male physicians may have dismissed their practical knowledge as inferior to university-trained theoretical medicine. Political authorities may have pushed them aside in favor of more formally educated medical practitioners. But women remembered what midwives had taught them. Mothers remembered who had saved their lives and their children's lives, and communities remembered which women could be trusted when medical emergencies threatened families with tragedy. By the 15th century, formal medicine was beginning to tighten its institutional control over childbirth practices. Male physicians with university degrees and Latin medical training gradually entered birthing chambers that had previously been exclusively female domains. Midwifery, which had once been the sole province of women who learned through experience and apprenticeship, was increasingly redefined and regulated by men who had theoretical knowledge, but often lacked practical experience with actual births. Many traditional midwives were systematically pushed aside, sometimes literally excluded from attending births, sometimes marginalized through legal restrictions that required them to work under male supervision, and sometimes replaced entirely by male practitioners who claimed superior medical knowledge based on formal education rather than hands-on experience. In subsequent centuries, the medieval midwife would become a figure who was both romanticized and erased from historical memory. Popular culture would sometimes portray her as a wise woman with mystical knowledge of herbal remedies and natural healing processes. Academic medicine would dismiss her as an ignorant practitioner whose lack of formal training made her more dangerous than helpful to women in labor. Neither portrayal captured the full reality of what medieval midwives actually did. They walked through blood, fear, superstition, and desperate circumstances, using whatever knowledge and tools were available to bring new life safely into the world. They served not because they were invited by historical authorities or recognized by official institutions, but because they were desperately needed by individual women and families who had nowhere else to turn during medical crises that could easily result in death for both mothers and infants. Even though modern medical practice has largely replaced the traditional midwife's role in most developed countries, and we don't always know their individual names or personal stories, we can still remember the essential service they provided. Quietly, repeatedly, courageously, they fought against medieval mortality rates, and sometimes won, bringing light into the world one successful birth at a time, one saved life at a time, one family at a time. Their legacy lives not in monuments or written records, but in the simple fact that human civilization continued through the medieval period because women like them were willing to risk their own reputations, economic security, and personal safety to ensure that new generations could be born safely and survive to adulthood, despite all the medical, social, and economic challenges that threatened their existence. Conclusion: scandals, traditions, and the timeless human story. As we reach the end of tonight's journey through the scandalous royal bedchambers of medieval Europe and the surprisingly wild origins of our cherished Christmas traditions, we're reminded that human nature, in all its glorious complexity, passionate intensity, and delightful contradictions, remains remarkably consistent across the centuries and continents that separate us from these historical figures. The queens we've encountered tonight, from Joanna of Naples with her alleged trapdoor to Wu Zetian's rise from concubine to emperor, from Eleanor of Aquitaine's literary revolution to Olga of Kiev's flaming pigeon warfare, all demonstrate that power, love, ambition, and survival have always driven people to make choices that shock, inspire, and fascinate observers long after the original actors have left the historical stage. These women weren't simply victims of their circumstances or passive participants in male-dominated political systems. They were active agents of their own destinies who used intelligence, charm, violence, sexuality, and whatever other tools were available to achieve their goals, protect their interests, and leave their marks on history, regardless of social expectations or conventional limitations. Their stories remind us that the fundamental human dramas of love and betrayal, ambition and revenge, power and vulnerability, courage and desperation continue to play out in every historical period, even if the costumes, settings, and specific details change to reflect different cultural contexts and technological capabilities. Similarly, our exploration of medieval Christmas traditions and their ancient Roman predecessors reveals how human communities have always needed celebrations that combine sacred meaning with secular joy, religious devotion with social bonding, individual reflection with communal celebration. The specific customs may evolve over time, but the underlying human needs for hope, connection, renewal, and shared meaning remain constant. Whether we're talking about Roman Saturnalia's role reversals, medieval Christmas's 12 days of sanctioned chaos, or modern holiday traditions that stress family gathering and gift exchange, we're really discussing different expressions of the same fundamental human desire to create light, warmth, and community during the darkest and most challenging times of year. The medieval midwife story provides perhaps the most profound example of human continuity across historical periods. Her knowledge, dedication, and courage in the face of life and death challenges represent qualities that transcend any specific era or cultural context. Every society needs people who are willing to serve others during their most vulnerable moments, who possess practical skills essential for community survival, and who can remain calm and effective when circumstances become dangerous or desperate. These historical narratives also remind us that the past wasn't simply a different version of the present with older technology and funny clothing. Medieval people faced genuine challenges that we can barely imagine. Political systems that offered little protection for individual rights, economic conditions that kept most people near subsistence level, medical knowledge that was often inadequate for treating serious illnesses or injuries, and social structures that limited personal freedom and individual choice in ways that would seem intolerable to modern sensibilities. Yet within these constraints, people still found ways to express creativity, experience love, pursue ambitions, create beauty, build communities, and find meaning in their lives. The queens who scandalized their contemporaries were often women who refused to accept the limitations placed on their gender and social roles. The Christmas celebrants who drank wassail and crowned lords of misrule were creating joy and community bonds despite harsh living conditions and uncertain futures. The midwives who risked their reputations and safety to help women survive childbirth were demonstrating the same compassion and professional dedication that we value in medical practitioners today, even though their tools and knowledge were limited by the scientific understanding available during their lifetimes. Perhaps most importantly, these stories demonstrate that historical change occurs through the accumulation of individual choices and actions rather than through impersonal forces or inevitable social evolution. Every queen who challenged conventional expectations, every midwife who saved a life, every community that preserved and adapted cultural traditions was participating in the gradual transformation of human society across generations. We are the inheritors of their courage, creativity, and persistence, just as future generations will inherit the consequences of our own choices and actions. The queens, Christmas celebrants, and midwives of medieval Europe weren't fundamentally different from us in their basic humanity, their capacity for both wisdom and foolishness, their ability to both create and destroy, and their fundamental need for love, purpose, and connection with others. Their stories continue to fascinate us because they remind us of the full range of human possibility, both inspiring and cautionary, that exists within every historical period and every individual life. Whether we choose to follow their examples of courage and creativity or learn from their mistakes and limitations is ultimately up to us. but their experiences provide invaluable guidance for understanding both our own potential and our own responsibilities. Thank you for joining me on tonight's exploration of medieval scandals and Christmas traditions. I hope you'll return for our next journey into the fascinating, complex, and endlessly surprising world of historical human experience, where every story reminds us that the past is never truly past, but continues to shape our present in ways both obvious and subtle, profound and playful. Until next time, may your own life be filled with the kind of courage, wisdom, and joy that would make even the most scandalous medieval queen proud, and may your celebrations be merry enough to honor the ancient traditions that connect us all across the centuries.